What's up guys? Welcome back to Vanover Customs. I'm super excited for today's video. We are going to be answering the question, which lathe should I buy and what are the things to watch out for when purchasing a new to me manual lathe. I'm really excited to go over this topic. It's something that I get asked a ton about. So let's jump right in. Oh hey, I didn't see you guys there. Now's a great time to talk about some disclaimers. I've been wanting to make this video for a really long time, but I knew this video would be long and take a long time to go through the detail that I want to put into it. But after getting about 5 or 7 calls per month, constantly talking to guys trying to buy lathes, I figured it was time. With that being said, we're going to be generalizing a lot in this video. It's my goal to provide the best information that I can to you guys, and as a result, I have my personal experience along with 4 or 5 other machinists, in addition to synthesizing everything I've seen on Practical Machinist and on YouTube. But even with all of that, I have my own bias, and the information itself has to be somewhat general. We don't have the time to go into each nuance about each question or rule. We can certainly do that in the comments, but to keep this video watchable, I'm going to try to focus on basic information. The other thing is, when we're talking about buying a lathe, I'm going to be assuming the lathe size is a standard-ish size, meaning 14 to 16 by 60. I do have a section on smaller lathes where we'll get into some of the benchtop or maybe even the precision lathes, and there are bigger lathes even still, but I'm going to be making this video aimed at the normal lathe purchaser, which is buying a standard engine lathe. And then lastly, I want to just say buying equipment can be overwhelming, especially a lathe, and especially if you haven't done it before. I want to give some encouragement. You can do it. You just need to take it one step at a time. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or anyone else in the community. Get the help you need, because it's a really awesome machine, but it is easy to get overwhelmed. Jumping right in, there are 2 main themes when answering this big question, what type of lathe you should buy. And this works on other pieces of equipment as well as automobiles. And that is quality and condition. Those 2 rules are going to be the umbrella under which we answer all the other questions. They're extremely important, quality and condition. I always start with the first question when someone asks me, and that is, what type of work do you do? Because that question sort of dictates where the conversation goes from there. Most people that I ask that question have no idea what type of work they could do. Probably because the people who do know the answer to that question already have purchased their machines and they're not asking that question. Most of the people that ask that question are looking to start a new shop or buy a piece of equipment for the first time, and they have no idea what type of work they're going to do. And that's okay, because sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. But I think it's important to try to think through the type of work you're going to be doing or want to be doing, because that does dictate what type of equipment to purchase. And for me, it really comes down to 2 categories. Is it repair work or is it precision work? And just briefly, repair work is going to be anything where you're fixing. Maybe you're making new shafts, maybe you're spray welding and repairing a shaft. And precision, I would think of like aerospace or any smaller stuff or any detailed stuff where you have to really have really nice tolerances. That is kind of the starting point for asking this question, precision or repair work. What do we got here? Oh, I'm not supposed to be showing you this. This is a secret. Well, anyway, this kind of reminds me of brands. And let's talk about brands, because people are very passionate about their brands. Monarch, Lion, Clausing, Pacemaker. Let's talk about the different lathe brands and which one you should buy. When we talk about manufacturers, that really nags at the quality piece of this conversation. Anything manufactured in the US, Japan, or Europe is a top-tier manufacturing place. Anything manufactured in China or even sometimes Taiwan is second tier. Now keep in mind, some of these manufacturers used to make stuff in one region and moved probably to a cheaper region, and other manufacturers have multiple lines. Like for example, Grizzly has a China line for their machines, and they also have a Taiwanese line, which is a little bit higher quality. So just keep that in mind. For Japanese lathes, we're looking at Meizak, Takisawa, Moriseki, and Okuma. There are a couple other brands, but those are kind of the big hitters. Now, it's important to understand that most of the manufacturers on this list do not currently make these machines. I'm assuming if we're watching this video, you're going to be looking at used machines. So most manufacturers on here of machines are 20, 30, 40 years old. Most of these manufacturers have either gone out of business, switched to CNC machines, or make different product entirely. When it comes to a Japanese machine, Japan makes really high quality product. I don't personally have any experience with any of those brands, but I would not hesitate to buy a Japanese machine. Now, with that being said, Moriseki seems to be the more popular one, at least in my region and what I see online. I would love to have a machine like that. However, I can say that the Japanese machines that I seem to come across are a little bit less frequent. There's lower inventory, and people like to raise the price as a result. So if you can find a good deal on a Japanese machine that isn't worn out, that would be a good option. But generally, I see that they tend to be overpriced for other comparable options. For European lathes, we have Cazeneuve, Toss, Harrison, Wheeler, Chamblin, Colchester, Lion, Summit, and ZMM. European lathes are also a top tier manufacturer. For the most part, Europe is really expensive to build equipment. So if it's coming from there, there's a reason, and usually the reason is there's a higher tolerance and a higher requirement for manufacturing. I personally don't have a lot of experience with the European lathes because there's not a lot of inventory here. Now with Colchester, if I remember correctly, Clausing is an American company. Colchester is in the UK, and they came together and made some machines that were sent to the US. I own a Colchester, I love it, but there is a little bit of breakaway between some of the Clausing machines and Colchester machines, but any of those brands probably make a high quality machine. Obviously, I own a Lion lathe, and Josh owns a Lion lathe, and I would highly recommend that. ZMM is actually one of the manufacturers for Lion, and they do make some stuff for Summit. There is a little bit different assembly technique between all three of those manufacturers, but a lot of the castings and products are similar, so just keep that in mind. Toss looks like a really nice machine, as well as the other one, which I have a hard time pronouncing, that starts with a C. But other than that, for a European lathe, if you can find one, that'd be an awesome opportunity. The one thing you need to keep in mind is parts availability. Most of the people who are seeing this are probably in the US, and a lot of the European machines have a hard time sourcing parts, and so just keep that in mind. I was looking at a Toss machine the other day, a really nice machine, but had zero availability here in the US, and so a lot of the parts that machine needed had to be made. If you're in Europe, obviously it makes sense to buy a European lathe, but just something to be aware of. For American lathes, that's pretty much my bread and butter because I am in America. They're the lathes that I have the most experience with, see the most online, and have run the most American machines. As for the list, we have Monarch, American, LeBlond, Hindi, Lodge and Shipley, Axelson, South Bend, and Cincinnati to kind of hit the major ones. Let's go and talk through some kind of high points of each. Monarch. Monarch is the one that everyone loves. Guess what? I love Monarch too. Monarch makes some of the highest quality lathes there are. If you can find a good Monarch, it's probably a well-made machine. The problem that I have, or the personal vendetta with Monarch, is that Monarch machines are kind of the 9/11 of the lathe community. And what that means is the quality is there, but so is the market. And the market is kind of overinflated from reality, at least in my opinion. And so Monarch lathes tend to command the highest price, and they're good, but there are other ones on this list that are just as good, or maybe a little less good, that are a lot cheaper. So that's kind of my opinion on Monarch. For American, I own an American pacemaker lathe. I personally think the quality is on par with Monarch, maybe 10% less, but I really think they make a great product. They tend to be a little bit more heavier duty than the Monarch, maybe by 10 or 20%. Monarch tends to be a little more precision oriented. Pacemaker tends to be a little bit more heavy duty oriented. That's just my personal opinion based on the machines I've seen. But I really like the Pacemaker machines. They have a lot of the great features like threading stops, heavy duty spindle, really easy to use, and they come in at a cheaper price. Now recently, the Pacemaker machines, I don't know if it's because of my videos and A-Bomb's videos, but they've been upcoming in price. But for the most part, Pacemaker lathes are quite a bit less than the Monarchs. And if you had two machines that were right next to each other of the same condition, which never happens, and one was a Monarch and one was a Pacemaker, I would buy the Pacemaker because it would probably go for 20 to 30% less. LeBlanc makes some really nice machines. When you go online and kind of ask the forums what people like the most, LeBlanc comes up again and again. They have their Hydro Shift lathe, or servo shift, I think it's called, where you can actually shift the speeds while the lathe is running. I've run a LeBlanc lathe and it's a really nice machine. LeBlanc is also another great manufacturer of lathes. They've also manufactured lathes, I think another 20 or 30 years later in the game. Monarch kind of dipped out a little bit earlier. Obviously they're still around, but they do different stuff. But LeBlanc has been making lathes, I think, a little bit longer than them, and they have a wider range, at least based on what I've seen, whether it's oil field lathes, precision lathes. They have a lot of inventory and a lot of different types of lathes. So I would always recommend a good LeBlanc lathe if you can find one. We have Hindi. Hindi also makes great machines, a little less common. I think Steve Summers has a Hindi lathe, if I remember right. It's kind of in that category with the Axelson, not as popular as the Pacemakers and as the Monarchs, but a good solid machine. I've never run one, but I've heard good things about them. I just know that the inventory appears to be a little bit less than some of the other models, so that's something to keep in mind. Lodge & Shipley, also kind of like LeBlanc, has been making stuff for a really long time, and they go back really early. So I don't know the exact numbers, but they were making stuff in the teens and 20s, 1900s, and they have stuff from big to small. They've got turret lathes, they got big lathes, they have a lot of different models. Typically, I see a lot of the Lodge & Shipley and Axelson machines in train machine shops. They have a lot of heavy duty stuff, like really heavy duty stuff, but they still do make good machines. I don't know that they were making machines recently, 70s, 80s, but someone will correct me. They tend to, in my opinion, the machines I see are bigger, older, heavier duty, and more abused, but they do still make high quality machinery. Axelson, kind of the same thing. Big, heavy duty machines, heavy pattern, really nice machines, but generally aren't known based on what I've seen for their smaller equipment. And they generally are in a lot of train repair shops. So I've seen some really nice Axelson lathes, but they do tend to be more heavy duty. And then we have South Bend and Cincinnati. For the most part, South Bend kind of has focused on the smaller lathes, the heavy 10 or the 9 or the 10. They make a lot of great pieces of equipment. More recently, I think that they've been putting their name on other equipment and having it being sourced overseas. But I know a lot of the older South Bend fans are fans of the smaller equipment, but they do kind of make a line as well. And then Cincinnati kind of has that tray top machine that's really famous, and maybe they also have a Hydro Shift, but they make a good machine. They make other milling machines and other great equipment, so they have a wide range of equipment. I don't see as many Cincinnati lathes, to be honest. I don't know if they made less of them or they're just less popular, but they are out there and they are a good machine as well. For Taiwanese manufacturers, things get a little bit more complicated. With some of the top tier brands, they manufacture and design the stuff in the same country, but with Taiwan, as we work down the list in quality, things become a little bit more muddy. as an example, Moriseki is an awesome Japanese machine, but a Taiwanese company has come in and cloned that machine and they sell it under another brand. And that happens a lot with Taiwanese companies. A lot of them tend to use the same manufacturer, but they put different labels and different brands. So that's something to be aware of. Now, some of the Taiwanese brands are Cadillac, Yam, Victor, Sharp, Kingston, Precision Matthews, Jet, Kent, Enco, MSC, and Acer, to name a few. There's a bunch more. Those are kind of the big ones. Cadillac and Yam, I believe, are pretty similar. They seem like pretty decent machines. Victor, I know A-Bomb has a Victor machine and a couple other YouTubers. It seems like the machines they made in the 80s and 90s were pretty decent Taiwanese machines, and I would definitely consider buying one. Kingston, I think, and Sharp, kind of similar in that they both have better quality Taiwanese machines, and I've also seen some pretty rough Kingston and Sharp machines. I do like some of the Sharp machines that I've seen, but they do tend to be newer, and the same with Kingston. You just want to make sure and see what you're getting, be cautious, but know that there can be good product coming out of Taiwan, and specifically, I think there are good Sharp machines and there are good Kingston machines. Precision Matthews, that's an interesting one because the owner of Precision Matthews works directly with Precision Matthews to kind of curate and get the best of both worlds out of a Taiwanese machine. The benefit of manufacturing in Taiwan is you can get the cost down, but some of the cons are you don't really get that good of support if you're not in Taiwan. Maybe the instruction manuals aren't that good. And Precision Matthews has done a really good job working with and staying on the manufacturers to make sure the products are coming out at a high quality. The manuals are very readable. They have a great distributor here in the US, so parts availability is great. I have no tie to Precision Matthews, but of the Taiwanese machines, I really have no problem recommending Precision Matthews. I have been looking recently at their top tier machine. I think it's a 1660 and it's about 20 grand. No, it's not a Lion, but it is a significant amount less. And for what you get, I think it is a really good value. I do know that they have some really cheap machines. I don't know too much about that, but some of the nicer machines I do really like. As far as Jet, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with Jet. We used to have a lot of Jet equipment at the theater several years ago, and the machine was okay. I think it was a milling drilling machine and a couple other machines. The problem with Jet and Grizzly, I'll kind of lump them together, is they make a wide variety of machinery from woodworking to metalworking, like drill presses, lathes, and what tends to happen just kind of as a generality, when you make a large array of equipment that's all over the place, you tend to be less focused on the details, and you tend to be much more likely to just acquire stuff and rebrand it than to really curate your own equipment. And that's what I've seen with Jet and with Grizzly and even some of the other brands similar, where they're just using their own equipment and their own name and just kind of rebadging everything. Kent, they seem to have good equipment as well, but I'll kind of put that in the same category as Kingston and Sharp. I've seen some decent Kent machinery, but I've also seen a lot of rebranded and relabeled stuff that didn't look so good. I probably wouldn't buy a Kent machine just with all the better options out there, but again, it's specific to the machine and the quality. And then we have Enco, MSC, very similar to Kent, Sharp. Again, Enco is similar to Grizzly, where a lot of rebranded stuff. I don't know that Enco ever made anything that was their own. Maybe you guys can kind of correct me down below, but I think a lot of their stuff is just badged Enco and probably made by the manufacturers that are making some of the other stuff. Now, same thing with MSC. MSC is a supplier here in the US. I don't think they make their own machinery. Same thing with KBC. I don't think they make their own machinery. I think they're rebranding it, but you guys can correct me. When it comes to Acer, Acer does seem to have some machinery that seems to be specific to them. I know a few people that have Acer machines and really like them. The machinery that I've seen, although it is similar to other models, does seem to be a little bit more unique, and it does seem to be of higher quality, so I would put them above Grizzly and Jet and KBC and Enco. but that's just my personal experience with Acer. Moving on to the Korean machines, the only one that I know of is Hoichon or Weichon. I know Jason over at Fireball Tool has a Hoichon machine, and it seems like a pretty decent piece of equipment. They're made in South Korea, and I don't know, I kind of think that they're patterned off of another company's lathe, kind of a similar thing that's going on with the Moriseki, where there was an original and then a kind of a clone. So a Hoichon machine might be a clone of another, but it seems to be of a decent quality. I would probably consider buying one, but then again, they don't come up that often, so just something to keep an eye out. And then Chinese, I would say that the Chinese machines in general, I would avoid. I don't have specific brands because a lot of these models like Jet and Kent and MSC, they have a Chinese line. Generally, they tend to be the cheaper machines, so smaller equipment like sub 12-inch swing, a lot of it tends to be Chinese. A lot of mini lathes are Chinese. I'm not saying there can't be high quality Chinese machines, but in general, most of the Chinese machines that I've seen have been at the lowest tier, probably because it's the cheapest to manufacture compared to Taiwan and Japan and American. So I personally wouldn't buy a Chinese machine, but that doesn't mean there aren't a couple good Chinese machines out there. I just don't know of them. The other thing you want to keep in mind is names aren't what they used to be. Specifically Clausing as an example, that machine has changed hands so many times. What a Clausing machine from the 60s is very different than a Clausing machine from the 80s and even today. A good machine from the 60s would be a Clausing, and even some of the machines they made in the 80s and 90s were good, but today it's a very different company. Same thing with Monarch. Monarch used to do really good stuff in the old days, 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s. Monarch is still around today if you Google it, but they're not making manual machines in the same way that they did before. So just be aware, just because something is the same brand or a popular brand that you've heard of, do some digging around, because companies have changed, especially since we've been manufacturing lathes for about 100 years, plus or minus 20 or 30 years. Companies' names have meant a lot of things over the years, so don't just take the brand at face value. The last point I want to make about brands is I would recommend that you buy an off-branded machine. And what I mean by that is if you purchase a Monarch or a Monarch 10EE, you're paying a premium because that's a top-tier brand that's extremely popular right now. Whereas if you're trying to find a LeBlanc or a Pacemaker, those brands, even though the quality is there, are less popular. So you're gonna pay quite a bit less than the equivalent Monarch. Now, when I'm trying to find machines, just like when I tried to buy that Pacemaker, I really wanted to get a Monarch, but the prices were so high and the machines were so few and far between, it just made it really difficult. Whereas this Pacemaker sat still for almost 6 months because no one wanted it, because it wasn't as desirable. And if you're trying to find a good deal, that's the best way to find a good deal. Sure, you can find a deal on a Monarch or a 10EE, for example, but it's gonna be a lot harder because everyone wants that. Whereas if you're trying to buy a LeBlanc lathe, even though it's desirable, it doesn't have the prestige that a Monarch, for example, has, but it still has most of the quality, if not all of the quality. When it comes to buying a machine, there are a couple features that are really important, and there are some features that it'd be nice to have, but aren't absolutely essential. I'm gonna rattle off some features, and then we're gonna jump into kind of more specifically what they are and how important they are. So metric and standard threading, we have a big spindle bore, high RPMs, heavy weights, coolant ready, 2-speed tailstock, variable speed spindle, collet closer and chuck, hardened bedways, clutched headstock, rapid traverse, reversing spindle, spindle brake, high quality spindle bearings, gap bed, quick change gearbox, hand scrape surfaces, oil lubricating system, and cam lock chuck, just to name a few. So let's jump into each of those features. Perhaps one of the most important features on a lathe is whether it has standard and metric threading. Now on this lathe specifically, we do not have both. We just have standard threading. And I think when you have to decide what you need on your lathe, you have to ask yourself what type of work you're going to be doing. If you're working on a lot of old iron, let's say you're on a farm, you have a bunch of old American equipment, you work on old tractors, and you do things mostly in SAE, standard is perfectly fine. I survived with standard on my machines because a lot of the repairs I did and things I'd made myself, and standard suited me well. But if you're working in aerospace or you're doing anything newer automotive, newer equipment, pretty much is all metric. So you're really gonna limit yourself if you have a machine that does standard only. Obviously, anyone across the pond who has a metric machine knows the importance of metric nowadays, but maybe they're asking the reverse question. Maybe they wanna have standard so they can work on some American style or Western style stuff. So I would say that is a very important thing to consider, specifically when you're looking at older iron in America. Most of it tends to be standard, and it's a little bit more difficult to find a machine that does both. If it's the only machine you have and you need metric, I would wait for a machine that does both. Next to metric threading, a large spindle bore is probably one of my favorite lathe features. It really makes doing work a lot easier. Now, large is a relative term. For an oil field lathe, this spindle being 4 1/8 is small, and for a small lathe, this is a huge spindle bore. But what I would say is get the biggest spindle bore you can. The main reason, which may be obvious, is fitting larger workpieces through the spindle. If you can fit it through the spindle, you can work on longer workpieces without the need of a steady rest. Obviously, you need a steady rest for certain operations, but the bigger your spindle, the less likely you need a steady rest, and that just makes it more convenient. The other point I want to make about the spindle bore is that a lot of old iron, at least here in the US, tends to have a small spindle bore. For example, on the pacemaker lathe, it has a 20-inch swing, but only a 2-inch spindle bore, whereas a new lathe with a 20-inch swing has a 3-inch spindle bore. And that's something that you can't change, or at least is very difficult to change. It's one of the reasons why you may want to stray away from doing an old machine if that's something that's really important to you. Another really important feature on a lathe is high RPMs. Now, I know people get hot and bothered about high RPM ranges, especially because carbide wants high RPM. But the reality is we need to focus on surface speed at the cutter when it comes to RPM. A lot of older lathes have max RPMs of 500-600 RPMs, but when you're turning a 24-inch workpiece, you're getting plenty of surface speed at the cutter, so that's not a problem. However, when you're purchasing a smaller lathe, like a South Bend Heavy 10, if that only goes up to 600 RPM and you're turning a 1-inch shaft, that's going to be a problem. On a lathe this size, it has a max RPM of 1,000 RPM, and to be honest, I run this lathe at 1,000 quite a lot, and I get great surface finishes on 2-inch workpieces with carbide. So if you're looking for a machine that has 1,000 or 1,200 RPM, I think you're gonna be fine. If you're looking for a machine that has less, 600, 500, and it's this size, I would probably avoid that machine. And again, if it's a big machine, the RPM is a little bit less critical because you're gonna be doing big work and you probably have plenty of surface speed at the cutter. Heavy pattern or heavy weights is another thing that a lot of manufacturers advertise, and that's pretty self-explanatory. If you look at a new machine, this is a 1454 size. A machine this size would be 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. This machine is 9,500 pounds. What does all that weight do? It just creates smoother cuts and cuts down on vibration. Is it the end of the world if you have the 4,500 pound machine? No, you can still do great work on that machine. But if you can get a heavier machine, it will give you benefits when it comes to dampening vibration and making sure everything is nice and rigid. The last point I want to make about machinery weight is that older equipment is a lot heavier than its newer counterparts. As an example, this Lion lathe is about 2,000 pounds heavier than the exact same machine made in 2024. The reasoning for that is over time, manufacturers have realized that casting is expensive, and if it's not absolutely necessary, they try to remove it from the process to keep the cost down and only have the amount of cast iron that's 100% necessary. Now sure, I'd rather have the heavier machine, which we have, but just keep in mind that newer equipment is going to be lighter as a result. Having the ability to run coolant on a lathe is 100% not necessary, but it is a really nice feature. And it's a feature that none of my 2 operating lathes have, but I will be having on my Lion lathe. And if I could start over, I would make sure it's on any machine that I purchase. The main benefit to running coolant is that you can really do certain operations much more efficiently. The one that comes to mind is drilling. When you drill, you produce a lot of heat, and to be able to run coolant continuously while you're drilling makes a huge difference. The other one that really is important is when you're machining size critical parts, running the coolant while you machine those parts keeps the temperature down on the part and allows you to be more accurate during the manufacturing process. Now, you can always let the part cool or manually cool it and take your measurements, but that just takes more time. The other way around that is to use a mist cooler like this. It's not as effective as coolant, but it's a good add-on, and especially if you're not set up for coolant, it's easy to add on and get some of the benefit of coolant, but even coolant is going to be more effective than this. Although a little bit more rare, a 2-speed tailstock is a really nice feature. It's 100% not necessary and you could totally get away without it, but if you can find it, it really makes your life a lot easier. The main benefit is it usually has a high and low speed, which is good because in high speed you can advance the quill quickly, so you can retract the drill really fast, especially when you're drilling. And in low speed, if you're running a large drill, you have plenty of torque so you don't have to wrench on the handle, and it just makes life a lot easier. Another really cool feature is a variable speed spindle. Now, unfortunately, this is not available on probably 95% of the lathes out there. It's more reserved for something like a Hardinge, HLV, or even some of the Precision Matthews higher end lathes have that as an option. Or in this case, we added it ourselves, which you can certainly do. But the main benefit is you can pick spindle speeds in between your pre-selected gear ratios. As an example, we can start this lathe up and it's in 1200 RPMs, but we can pick any range in between those speeds. It's kind of nice when you're doing tapping. You can actually use this in a slow speed and slow it all the way down to 0 and then reverse out and do the same thing and ease into it. It's kind of similar to having a clutched lathe, even though it's slightly different, but it has some of the similar benefits. Another cool feature on a lathe is a collet chuck and closer. Here's an example of a collet chuck. There is no closer, but the main benefit of a collet chuck is high repeatability, safety, and ease of use. On a lot of lathes, they have something similar to this mounted to the chuck, and they have a closer in the back that allows you to open the collet so you can quickly feed work. Collets in general are more accurate than chucks, and with a closer, you can open the chuck or collet quickly to take your workpiece in and out. Now, if you're doing a lot of job shop or repair work, a collet closing option probably isn't of that much value, but if you do a lot of small work and you need stuff to be accurate, a collet closing feature and a collet chuck on a lathe adds a lot of value, both in repeatability and in speed. And the nice thing is when you have this, because it's smooth, it makes a much safer operating experience. When you're working with this chuck, you have to be cognizant of not getting too close because this is sharp and can be very dangerous. Whereas when you have a collet or collet chuck mounted, you can work right up next to the chuck, and because nothing sticks out, it's nice and safe, and you can get right up to the chuck and do some close work. Hardened bedways is another feature you want to make sure your lathe has. To be honest, most new equipment and even a lot of old equipment has hardened bedways. Most of the equipment that doesn't have hardened bedways is really cheaper lathes or really low quality machines. To be honest, if a machine didn't have a hardened bedway, I probably wouldn't buy it. The bed is one of the most important parts of a lathe, and it takes the most wear and abuse. And being hardened, it really holds up to a lot of that abuse. So if it's not hardened, it's gonna wear out quickly and probably not be good for any level of repeated use. Shout out to my friend Josh Topper. He's always talking about clutched lathe stocks, and there's a reason for it. Clutched lathe stocks are really nice. As an example, this machine has a spindle on, turns on, and then by operating this lever, you operate a clutch that spins up the chuck. The main benefit for that is you can feather the clutch, and it has some of the similar benefits that that variable speed offers. If you have a large workpiece and you have a non-clutched lathe, sometimes if you turn it on and it fires up too quickly, that workpiece can loosen. Also, being able to feather the clutch can allow you to rotate the chuck around so you can get the chuck wrench in the right position or even reposition the workpiece. If possible, I would try to get a clutched headstock, but if that's not possible, a variable speed headstock is the next best thing. A rapid traverse for the carriage is a really nice feature. For a standard size lathe, it's a nice feature, but it's not a must. As you go up in lathe size, I would consider it a must. Anything bigger than probably 100, 120 inch in swing or a super fat carriage, it's gonna be a really nice feature. On the long lathe lengths, it's nice because you can push a button and it'll rapid the carriage, and it's gonna be a pain to crank the carriage 12 feet in length. With a really big carriage, it's also really nice because sometimes you're really laboring to move that carriage. So to quickly move it, you just push a button, and that's pretty nice. I would say a forward and reversing spindle is a must. 95% of the work you're gonna be doing is in the forward direction. There are some operations like sanding I like to do in reverse, and there's also situations where you need to run a tool holder upside down, and reverse is really nice with that. One thing you do need to be aware of with a thread-on chuck is sometimes they can loosen in the reverse position, but for the most part, you're running it in the forward direction, so that's not an issue. There are some lathes that don't have a forward and reverse. Some lathes are reversed with a gear set and don't reverse with an actual motor direction switch, but either way, it's really good to have. Another really nice feature to have is a brake for the spindle. There's two main types of brakes, an electronic brake and a mechanical brake. The mechanical brakes tend to use a clutch mechanism or shoes to stop the spindle, where the electronic ones are typically a VFD ramp down. If your lathe has a foot brake is also really nice. Some of the foot brakes can stop the spindle instantaneously. That is really nice if you're doing threading, especially up to a shoulder. You can thread up to the shoulder, hit the brake, the chuck will stop, and you can avoid crashing, so that's awesome as well. The brake itself is not really 100% necessary, but it is a nice feature to have if you can find it. Making sure your lathe has a nice set of spindle bearings is 100% critical to the operation of the lathe. In this machine, it's renowned for a triple stack bearing. Most engine lathes have a support bearing in the back and have a main bearing in the front, but on this Lion lathe, it has two main bearings and a support bearing in the back. It has a couple other ones in the center, but those are the big bearings. Having multiple bearings in the front really helps with the load and helps with the precision. Obviously, not all lathes are gonna have a double stack in the front, but the main point here is to get quality bearings. FAG, SKF, Timken, Koyo, those are a few bearing companies, just to name a few. On a newer machine, hopefully they advertise the type and quality and brand of bearing, whereas on an older machine, you're gonna have to dig around. If the bearings are bad on the lathe that you're purchasing, it's probably not worth buying the lathe. I know, for example, on my Colchester lathe, it has gamut bearings, and that replacement bearing set is about $2,000, and that's about what I paid for the lathe. So for the most part, the bearings are gonna be very durable and hard to damage, but that's something you wanna just keep an eye on and check because it is fairly important. Another interesting feature you may wanna watch out for is a gap bed on your lathe. A gap bed is basically a removable section of the ways that extends the working area either for the chuck, the workpiece, or both. On a bigger lathe, it's probably a little less crucial because you have a lot of clearance anyway, but specifically on a smaller or mid-sized lathe, a gap can really add a lot of usable space to the working area. Most of the lathes I have in my shop do not have a gap bed, but it is really nice that this one does have a removable gap. You just have to be careful if you are removing the gap that you reinstall it properly, because if you don't, your ways won't line up and it can cause issues with the carriage. To be honest, having a quick change feed box, I would say, is a must when it comes to buying a lathe, at least a lathe you're hoping to do any serious work with. On the pacemaker here, it does only standard threading, but even so, with just the change of a couple tumblers, we get about 40 or 50 different speeds and threading options. Even on the Lion lathe, it has 40 or 50 different threads in standard, 40 or 50 in metric, and another 20 or 30 in diametral pitch and modular. And all that is done with the quick change gearbox. On some cheaper lathes or even small lathes, there are change gears. And basically what that means is you have to take the cover off and swap some gears in order to achieve these threads or speeds or feeds. And even some gearboxes have a gearbox and change gears to achieve like metric threading or diametral pitch. Ideally, getting a gearbox that will do everything with no change gears is recommended. But if you can't have that, I would say get a gearbox that has the threads and speeds that you use the most. So if you use standard, a standard gearbox, and if you use metric, a metric gearbox, and obviously having both is ideal. Hand scraped surfaces are one of the most important aspects of any machine tool. And if you can find a machine with any hand scraping left, you're gonna be in really good shape. On a new machine, I wouldn't buy a new machine if it didn't have any hand scraping. And most new machines do have some hand scraping, and a lot of machines have hand scraping and turkite. On an older machine, it's gonna be hard to find with any hand scraping intact because over time, the scraping wears off. Now, one of the reasons why a newer machine or even an older machine may not have any hand scraping is scraping is very labor intensive. And for that reason, a lot of cheaper equipment avoids scraping to try to save cost. I've seen a lot of new Chinese machines with no scraping. Everything is just ground and assembled. That's fine, but scraping really increases the precision of the machine and oil retention, and it's really the top way to achieve machine tool accuracy. So if possible, look for hand scraping. If I were to see an old machine that was 30, 40 years old and it had a lot of hand scraped surfaces, that would be a huge green flag for me on that machine because it would tell me that the machine has either been rebuilt or has very little wear. Let me let you in on a little bit of a secret if you didn't already know, but oil and lubrication is probably one of the single biggest factors in determining the service life of any piece of equipment. A lathe is no different. The ways on a machine need to always be oiled and kept lubricated, not only to flush away chips and debris, but to make sure that the carriage slides effectively. On this lathe, we have a one-shot oiling system outfitted. What that means is when you pull this lever, it oils the carriage, the ways, and the top slide. Now, each lathe is a little bit different. On my Lion, it actually has an oil pump that does the same thing. But if I was purchasing a newer or used machine, I would make sure that the lathe carriage has some type of oiling system. In addition to carriage oiling, headstock oiling, and gearbox oiling is also very important. A lot of lower end lathes have what they call splash lubrication. Basically what that is cheap and simple lubrication. You take a box, you make sure it's sealed and you fill oil, and as the gears run, it splashes it around. That does work and it is fairly effective, but the better lubrication is what I'll call fed oil. So oil is done through a pump and it goes out to multiple lines and it sprays oil in the right spots. It's gonna be a little bit harder to inspect, but ideally, especially for a headstock, you want an oil-fed system with a dedicated pump and individual lines. On a lot of higher quality machines, those oil lines are fed directly to the bearings, specifically in the front and back, to the oil sight, and to several other places. If possible, I would try to purchase a machine that has an oil sight and a fed oiling system specifically for the headstock. This machine does have a fed oiling system for the gearbox, which is really nice, but most machines I've seen just have splash lubrication for the gearbox, and for that, it's probably fine. The last feature we're going to talk about is the spindle mount. Now, when it comes to lathe spindles, there's three main types, starting with the worst type, and that is a thread-on. The second type is what this is a thread-on taper, and the last type is a cam lock spindle. There are a couple other types, but those are the three most common. Typically, the thread-on style is on the smaller, older lathes, like the plain bearing lathe machines. This type is really common on lathes of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the cam lock is kind of the newer standard and is the preferred method. The reason why this style is not that great is it requires a special wrench, and on some machines, I haven't had the issue with this one, but I have had the issue with my Colchester. If you run the lathe in reverse, because this is threaded, the chuck can unscrew, and that can be a little bit dangerous. Now, we talked about this before. If you make sure it's tight, because you're only running in reverse 5 or 10% of the time, it's really not that big of a deal, and as long as it's tight, it shouldn't unscrew, but technically it is possible, and I've had it happen to me. That's why this style is probably not as good. Now, I will say this thread-on long taper style is considered better for heavier duty cuts. If you look at the old pacemaker manuals, they offered two different types of spindle mounts, and the thread-on style was recommended for a more heavy duty application, but it's just a little bit less convenient, both in terms of needing the special wrench and also in terms of just installation and removal. The newer type I don't have on any of my machines, but it is a cam lock style, and it's really nice because all you have to do is take the chuck key, loosen each of the 4 cams, and you can slide the chuck out. It allows you to install the chuck a little bit easier, and it's nice and secure. If possible and you're getting a machine, it'd be nice to have a cam lock feature, but if you can't have that, the thread-on tapered chuck is the way to go. I would stay away from the solely thread-on chucks, specifically on the smaller lathes. Well, do you go big or do you go small? When it comes to lathe size, there's a couple questions that we need to answer to figure out what the right lathe is. For one, bigger lathes can do small work, but not the other way around. It's important to note that if you have a really small lathe, you're not going to be able to do huge jobs on it. But if your lathe is large, you can always put a smaller chuck in it and get the smaller work done. So if you can only get one lathe, I would err on getting a bigger lathe. The other thing is the length. Do you get a long lathe or a short lathe? To be honest, I would not get a short lathe. Anything for a standard size lathe, meaning a 14, 15, 16-inch swing, I wouldn't get anything shorter than 36 inches. The reason for that is if you have the length, you can always use a little amount of it, but if you need the length and you don't have it, then you don't have it. There are a couple lathes that I've seen that have a big swing but are really short in length, and those lathes I would say are not desirable. For example, I've seen 1620, 1630 lathes. I wouldn't buy any lathe like that. It's too short. By the time you put the tailstock on with the center, you only have like 20 inches of working room, and that's just not enough. The other thing to keep in mind is that a standard size lathe is more desirable. So you and every other person in the world who's looking for a lathe is probably looking for a 1660 engine lathe size because it's the most universal. So those lathes tend to be more expensive, at least compared to lathes that are 120 inches or 36 feet long, because they're more niche application. So although getting a standard size lathe is recommended, sometimes getting an odd size lathe can save you money. But again, I would err on a bigger and longer lathe if you're gonna get an odd size lathe. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is the last point about the size, is that larger machine, specifically long lathes, can get very pricey to move. A super long lathe, longer than, I don't know, 10, 12 feet, is gonna be a lot more expensive than a 12, 8, 7, 6 foot lathe because of the rigging and the trailer requirements, so just keep that in mind. This is a fun one, new versus old, and to be honest, I'm not gonna give you a flat out answer here because for you, it's gonna depend on what you're doing. But let's list some of the benefits of each. So newer lathes tend to have more features. Newer machines tend to require less work to put in service. Newer machines generally are less worn. Newer machines tend to be more expensive, and newer machines tend to hold tighter tolerances better. Older machines tend to be built better. They tend to look cooler, tend to be heavier in nature, simpler to work on, and to be cheaper to get into. Now, again, for you, I can't make that decision. For me, if you were to ask me 3 years ago, I would have told you older machines every day of the week. The main reason, well, because I didn't want to go out and drop 50 to 100 grand on a new lathe. And there's a lot of value in that. If you put the time and love into some of this old equipment, you can pretty much conquer all of the old issues and keep a lot of the benefits and cool factor of old equipment. But over time, what I've learned is there are just certain things that no matter how much you restore or fix on an old machine, they're never going to have. Some of those things are things we've talked about: metric threading, big spindle bore, tighter tolerances. And for that reason, if you were to ask me today, I'd probably recommend a newer lathe for most people. I tell people all the time, if I were to start my shop over again and I had 100 grand to spend on all the equipment, which really isn't a lot, I'd spend most of it on a brand new lathe and a Bridgeport, and I'd spend whatever money I had left buying cheap used stuff, because those two machines do 80% of the work. And to be honest, having machines that are tight, have good tolerance, and easy to use is worth no amount of money, basically. But if you're just starting out, new machines just aren't gonna be an option. And for that, you just need to know what pros and cons you're getting into. And in the same vein as the last question, restoring versus putting into service, if you are getting that older machine, should you pull it apart and restore it, or should you put it right to work? And to be honest, this is gonna be very dependent on you. Let me list some quick bullet points and then we can kind of discuss it a little bit more. So restoring a machine helps the owner know the machinery better. Restoring can save money, keyword there, can. Restoring can build a better machine if done properly, and restoring can make good videos for you guys. Running a machine as it is, it can make money quicker. Running a machine is a simpler solution. Running a machine is cheaper initially, and running a machine makes a lot more business sense. Guys, to be honest, restoring machinery has a lot to do with how busy you are, how fast you need that machine to start making money, or if you're using it for hobby, start having fun, how patient you are at taking something apart, and how deep you want to go, On a lot of the restorations I've done, I've gone pretty deep, and after the fact, I'm glad, but when you're deep in a 2-year restoration, it takes a lot of tenacity to continue forward. As I move forward as a business, I'm not gonna be able to take 2 years on a restoration. It's just not going to make sense. Maybe as a passion project, which a lot of these restorations sort of are, but you really have to analyze where your business or hobby is. And if I could recommend anything, it would be to take one project on at a time. Most people that I know who are into car projects or machine projects do the same thing. They get a bunch of projects going and they never get anything done. That drives me crazy. If you're gonna do a restoration, my advice, great, do it. But just pick one machine to restore, work on that, and have all your other machines up and running. It's extremely overwhelming when you go out and buy a bunch of old equipment and you want to restore 10 or 12 machines and you have a shop full of 10 or 12 machines, none of them that run, and you need all of them to fix all the other ones. So if you can, make sure you have a couple machines that work well, and if you really do want to restore one, I would limit it to a very small number, but that's just my personal experience. When it comes to any type of custom project, it's really important to realize what things can be changed and what things can't be changed. Growing up, I knew a guy that was really into cobalts. He put a lot of money and time into making a Cobalt a great car. But guess what? At the end of the day, when you dump 10 or 20 grand into a Cobalt, it's still a Cobalt and it's not a Corvette. And I think that logic applies here. There are certain features on a lathe that you can upgrade and you can change, and there are certain ones that you're just stuck with. For example, on my blue lathe, it had an old 2-speed motor. We changed that. We upgraded it. It didn't have variable speed. We added that. Doesn't have a tailstock chuck. We make it. Great. But there's certain things that you can't change, and it's really important to figure out what those things are and what deal breakers you can't live without that can't be altered. Some things that are the most important parts of a lathe are the bed wear. Again, we can scrape in a top slide. We can grind in a chuck, but grinding the bed on most lathes doesn't make sense. If you have a South Bend Heavy 10, maybe it makes sense even though it really doesn't, but it's small. You pay $1 or $2 and you get it reground, even though it doesn't make sense because that lathe ain't worth it, it's somewhat cost effective. If you buy a 9,000 pound pacemaker and the bed is shot, regrinding the bed is gonna cost $7,000, $8,000. It's not worth it. So making sure that the wear on the bed is at a minimum is very, very important. The top slide, the nuts, that stuff, it can be changed relatively simple. Something like the spindle bore. Is it possible? Well, I like to do the impossible, so I'm not gonna say it's impossible to change the spindle bore size, but I'm gonna say it's very close to impossible. You'd have to rip the headstock apart, you'd have to change gears, so let's just call it impossible for the sake of the argument. So if you want a big spindle bore and it doesn't have it, don't buy a lathe with a small spindle bore. The travel of the tailstock. If you need a long travel to do deep drilling, but your travel is only 4 inches, you're probably not gonna be able to change that. Something else that's really big, the length of a lathe. Every time I've bought a lathe, after buying it, I've wished it's longer, every time. And when I bought this Lion lathe, I wanted a longer lathe. But you know what? It was the longest lathe I could find that met my specs, and it's gonna be a great machine. But the point is that it can't be changed or altered, and it doesn't make sense even if you could do it. People have said add an extension, but it doesn't make any sense. You'd have to redo all the screws and feed rods, and it would never be the same. It's just not worth even considering. So those are the things that you need to keep in mind, the things that cannot be changed and that are kind of immovable when it comes to purchasing a machine. Well, the next section is gonna be a lot of fun because we're gonna be going into the wear and condition of a machine and checking each component and what to look out for. And what I'll say is when we started this video, there were 2 things that are the umbrella topic. That's quality and condition. So when it comes to condition, we're gonna talk about what we need to inspect so we get a machine with good condition. I've been using cars as an analogy through this video, not only because I like cars, but because everyone can kind of relate to cars. We all have cars. And in the same vein, I want to make a comparison here. Lathes do have a lot of parts that can go wrong. And as we talk about the different aspects, you're gonna be overwhelmed at, is this bad, check this, check this. And yeah, we do wanna check all those things, make sure we make a good purchase. But compared to a car, a lathe really is a simple machine. It has way less moving parts, and even compared to other pieces of machinery, it's relatively simple, and it's made for a lot of extended use. Obviously, we have the hobby machines, which we'll be talking about, and the benchtop machines, but most standard size engine lathes are really industrial duty, and they're really fairly simple. And as long as there's nothing major, parts and pieces can be changed, and you can get back up and running for a long service life. So we're gonna go over the lathe and talk about different aspects of wear and issues that we're gonna look for, and I broke it down into 15 different things to look out for, and we'll go through each of them. I've arranged all of these steps in order of importance in terms of things to inspect on a lathe, and I've tried to keep it simple and straightforward, so if you're going to inspect a lathe, you can reference this pretty easily. The first one here is bed wear. Now I'm gonna use my own lathe here on the chopping block and just show what other people have pointed out in the comments before. And that is that this lathe bed is worn. Now, to be honest, it's not worn too bad. It's probably worn maybe 4 thousandths or so, and it is hardened, but that wear is real and it's here. So a quick test to check how worn a lathe bed is to run the carriage all the way down in both directions, back and forth. Now typically, if the carriage is loose here and super tight at the end, that can tell you that there's a significant amount of bed wear. It's not a 100% conclusive test, but it is a quick test that can give you an idea of how worn it is. If it's just as easy here as it is there, that's probably a good sign. A little bit more of an accurate test is to bring an indicator and to take several measurements as this traverses. You can also take a micrometer and measure different areas on the bed, and there's a couple great videos on tips and tricks on how to do that. So we're not gonna get into that. We're just gonna keep it simple. Number one is bed wear. Make sure the bed is in good condition, because if that's shot, it's pretty much not worth it. I would say 1 thousandth or less wear is excellent. 1 to 3 thousandths of wear is good. 4 to 7 thousandths is fair, and 7 to 30 thousandths is clapped out. An important point is 1 thousandths of wear does not transmit into 1 thousandths undersize at the chuck, which is really important. And that kind of leads to, does a worn out lathe in the bed make good parts? And the answer is it depends. For a lot of the work that people do, it's going to be fine as long as it's not clapped out. The reason why 1 thousandths of wear does not translate into 1 thousandths undersize is a couple reasons. The first one is that when you're translating 1 thousandths of wear over the width of the carriage, you're kind of evening it or averaging it out. And the other reason is you're working on a radius, so those measurements are halved, and you're also just coming down on the edge of a cylinder, and so it's not a 1-to-1 representation. That is good news, and what that means is if it's worn 1 thousandths or 2, typically you're gonna be under like 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 tenths across, which really isn't too bad. The other thing you want to check with the bed is a visual inspection. That may seem obvious, but it's pretty important. You want to make sure there's not a lot of dings or dents, and it looks pretty good. As you can see in this one, except for this area over here where the tailstock rides and the tailstock doesn't even come up this far, the lathe area is actually pretty good. There's no real dings or dents that are obvious. A couple of little marks, but overall this lathe visually looks pretty good. You also want to make sure that the lathe is clean and shiny, and that there's no black oil. I left this on here just so you can see, but we do have a little bit of dark oil. That's probably from me sanding, as I shouldn't be doing without being covered, but hey, sometimes you gotta do it, and it can leave kind of like a black film. You really wanna avoid a lathe that's super dirty and greasy on the ways, or that's really has a lot of dark here. So again, just something to be aware of. Even though the bed and regrinding that is a pain in the butt, buying new bearings for your lathe is extremely pricey. Fortunately, most lathe bearings are very robust and they're very hard to damage. But if the bearings have been run loose or there was an excessive amount of welding on the lathe improperly grounded, the bearings can be damaged. Now, it is a little bit difficult to test the bearings on a lathe. However, if you are able to make any cuts and you have a weird chatter that's unexplained, that can be kind of a more in-depth way to test the spindle bearings. The best way, and even the quick way, is to go ahead and chuck up a rod in the chuck, put an indicator on it, and rip on the rod. And if you see that the chuck moves on the indicator, probably any more than about 5/10, you're looking like you probably have some bad spindle bearings. I've done that test on this lathe when the spindle bearings were loose. Yes, they were at one point, and I had like 20 thousandths of movement on the indicator. We tightened them. I had about 4 or 5/10, and then I measured it on the pacemaker, and we had about 4 or 5/10. So just kind of from the seat of my pants, I would say anything 5/10 or less is probably pretty good. Anything more than that is probably unacceptable in terms of spindle deflection. The next thing you'll want to check that's pretty important is the headstock gearing. And if you'll notice, we're starting with things that are hard to change. As we move down the list, there'll be things that are a little bit less significant and easier to service. Your headstock gearing is very difficult, if not impossible, to replace, especially main gears, bevel gears, bowl gears. A lot of the gearing on this old machinery is no longer available, so it is fairly important. What you want to do is turn the lathe on, run the machine, make sure it's nice and quiet, or that the noise in the spindle is acceptable. The best way to do that is to run it in the highest speed and in the lowest speed and compare. Generally, in the middle of the speed range, the noise will be about as minimal as it can be. If you have straight cut gears in your spindle gearing, the noise is going to be louder. I know this machine does have straight cut gears. Straight cut gears have their benefits. Some of the Monarchs have a helical gear, so they run quieter and smoother. So that's something to keep aware of. But generally, you want to make sure the spindle and the headstock is not generally noisy. Specifically on these Colchesters, they actually are known for a pretty loud headstock. And on this machine, the headstock was relatively quiet. And so that's how I felt comfortable buying this machine. But a loud headstock can be indicative of the headstock going bad, or even on some cheaper lathes, a loud headstock sort of is what it is. I know on some import machines, they come from the factory pretty noisy just because the deburring process is pretty bad and there's a lot of straight cut gears and the fit isn't that great. But obviously, the more quiet the headstock, the better the news. The next most important thing I would say is the cross slide wear. We're starting to get to stuff that can be changed but requires a little bit more work. The easiest way to check this is to run this all the way to the end. Notice how easy it spins, and it gets harder here, all right? And the same thing in the opposite direction, spins nice and easy here. And look at how hard that is to turn there. What this tells you is that the lathe is more worn, and it's worn in a bell shape or a curve, meaning in the center where most of the work is done, it's more worn and operates nice and freely, and in the ends, it's pretty tight. Now you can remedy this by scraping the machine in, which is what we're doing on the Lion lathe. It can be fixed, but it does take a decent amount of effort and disassembly of the apron, the scraping skills and the tools, so it can be addressed. But ideally, a lathe with the least amount of worn top slide, the better. The other thing is you can check this more accurately by running it to the loose areas, putting a dial indicator on here, and using a pry bar to kind of move in out. You can even do it by hand and see how much the indicator moves and then run it to where it's tight. There are other tests that are more in depth, but again, if you're going to check a lathe on site, these are some of the quicker checks so you can get an idea of the wear and where you're at. Moving right along, next you want to check out the compound for wear. Now admittedly, the compound generally is used a lot less than the top slide, and so on a lot of equipment that I've seen, the top slide is less worn, which is good. It means it's going to require less work, but it's also less critical because the top slide is mostly not being used. If it's super worn out, it's not the end of the world. You can lock it down and do 90% of the operations with it jammed solid or having issues. But in order to inspect it, it's the same thing. You want to run it all the way out, and I have mine loose. You want to make sure it operates smooth, and you want to see if it's tight. And if I remember right, yeah, it's tight at the end, and then it gets easier. Yeah, see, it's easy there, and then it'll probably get tight again. A lot of these lathes wear in a similar manner. And you want to check the backlash. I know we didn't mention that on the top slide, but it's the same thing. Both in the compound and on the top slide, you want to check the backlash. And the way that you do that is turn it one direction, stop, and see how much free play it has in the nut. On this lathe, let me just zero it off. Looks like we have 8 thousandths of backlash. That's extremely good. And here on the top slide, looks like we have 14 thousandths. Also not too bad. I replaced that nut about a year ago. If you have like half of a handle turn like we had on the Lion, that'd be something you want to watch out for. That's one of the easier things to fix on these lathes. Still can require some work, but by replacing the nut or the screw shaft, you can remedy that. So that's something you want to watch out for. The next inspection you want to do is on the tailstock, and the main thing you want to watch out for on the tailstock is see how much binding you have in the handle or the quill. On this one, I can just whip the handle and it shoots the quill right out. That's good. Notice we have some lubrication. That's good to see. If this is all rusted and corroded, that's bad news. If this hand wheel is really difficult to turn, that's also bad news. I've seen that a lot on older lathes. The other thing you want to keep in mind, just like we talked about, is the backlash. So on this one, I know it's not that great. Well, that's not too bad. I have probably like 1/8 of a turn before we engage. I've seen a lot of these tailstocks where they're clapped out, and it's common because they do take a lot of abuse. So you want to make sure that the nut in there is not too worn. And another kind of additional item that you want to check that not everyone does is there's a keyway slot in the bottom that keeps your drill chuck from spinning. You want to grab it and rotate it, and see here how mine moves, not the chuck. So this is bad. Now, I've been using the lathe like this for 3 years. It's fine, but what happens is when you go and you drill, what'll happen is this will just kind of turn on you, and over time it'll wear out that keyway slot. On the pacemaker, it's pretty tight, and on the Lion, it's really, really tight. So that's something you want to just check. That's a relatively simple thing to fix. Generally, these quills are hardened, and generally that keyway is either brass, bronze, or sometimes steel. So all we have to do is pop the quill out and replace that piece. But it's something you want to be aware of. If this moves a lot and has a lot of up and down movement, then that's going to be a little bit more difficult to replace. Even if your quill does have, 1/2 thousandths of up and down movement, it's not ideal, but if you run with the lock on, that can kind of mitigate some of that up and down movement. The next thing you want to check when you're inspecting a lathe is electrical. You want to make sure that the machine powers up in both forward and reverse. This machine is relatively simple, and I'm not going to turn it on right now because I have the carriage over here. but you wanna make sure all the switches work. You wanna go into the electrical cabinet if it has one. Generally, lathes do not. Of this size, bigger ones will have their dedicated cabinet in the back by the backsplash. Go in there, poke around, make sure there's nothing that's burnt on the contactors or electrical board. Generally, you just wanna make sure your coolant pump works. On a lot of lathes that have coolant, the pumps stop working. Pumps go bad pretty frequently because they get clogged, people get lazy. So if it has coolant, check that. It's likely that it doesn't work. Every machine that I bought that had a coolant pump, the coolant pump was down. So it's a pretty common failure. The next thing to inspect is a little unusual, but it is the tooling on the machine. Now, it doesn't technically matter in terms of the machine itself, but the tooling that's near the machine or that comes with the machine can actually tell you a lot about the user of the machine. If you come up and you see something like this, where all the tooling has its own place, that's gonna tell you that whoever used the machine probably cared enough to take care of the machine. A lot of equipment that I come up to, the tooling is on the ground, it's rusted, you have a lantern tool post with like one tool holder that's looked like it's been beat up with a hammer. If you see that, that's gonna give you an idea of the type of person that used the machine. If the tooling is stored on the floor, like if you got chucks on the floor, steady rests on the floor around the machine, it is fairly common, but that's not as nice if you have chucks and steady rests on a cart, or a lot of times you'll see custom chuck racks and shops. That's better. That gives you an indication of the type of person who was using it. Another thing that's kind of a bonus is our tools sitting on rags. Now, I see this a lot at other shops, commercial places. I've even worked over at the CTA where they would get you in trouble if you set tools on the machine like this, or even on a cart. They have a very specific rule that you have to have your tooling on a rag and your metrology sitting on a rag. And the purpose for that is to keep all the machine surfaces from getting scratched up. Again, does it matter about this machine specifically? No, but it gives you an indication. If you go up to a machine and they have all the tooling sitting on a rag near the machine, it probably tells you they're taking a little bit more pride in taking care of the tooling and protecting the surfaces on the machine itself, as opposed to just having tooling everywhere willy-nilly. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, if you're gonna be getting any tooling with the machine, inspecting that tooling is a good idea as well to make sure it's nice and orderly. The next thing you wanna inspect when it comes to a machine is the paint. Give you a shot of our Cincinnati here because it has a lack of paint. Let me just say that paint doesn't matter. It has no bearing on how the piece of equipment functions. However, if you come up to a machine and it's been painted 100 times, that's not really ideal. So that's something I would watch out for. A lot of times, all that paint can be caked on and can be covering stuff up. The other thing is, if something has just been repainted before you buy it, be alert. Some people like to paint equipment and try to get more money out of it. Sometimes that's fine because they are taking the pride to present a good machine, but a lot of times the people who tend to paint a machine before selling it, they're trying to cover it up. This machine, for example, looks terrible. However, someone could come in here and quickly paint it and try to sell it for a lot more money. Again, the paint doesn't matter, but someone who's trying to extract more value can use paint to hide things. So just be aware. The next thing you want to take a look at when you're looking at a machine is grease and oil. If you walk up to a machine and it's covered in grime and grease like this, dust, it's telling you that the machine has been sitting for quite some time. Not necessarily a bad thing, but machine tools are designed to be used, and it's better if they're being used and lubricated than to let sit and get dirty. I've actually neglected this machine, and it gives us a good example of what some of the grime can look like and dust. Hopefully we'll get to this machine one day. The other thing you want to check out in terms of grease and oil is there oil flow in the oil sight, and does it look clean? Most machines have an oil sight, and if you turn the machine on and you don't see any flow in that oil sight, that's a huge red flag. It means that the pump isn't working or the machine's low on oil. If the oil's dirty, that's a red flag. It should be clean. But if you are seeing flow and it is clean, that's a good sign. While we continue to put my lathe on the chopping block, the next thing we need to talk about is half nut wear. On this machine particularly, I know that the half nuts are worn. Now, unfortunately, checking the half nuts is very difficult because they're usually behind. They're hard to visually inspect, and to be honest, they're kind of a pain to replace and can be hard to source. So that's why we gave them their own section. An easy way to inspect them is to come up to the machine and engage the half nut and to see how much movement back and forth you have. Now, obviously, this machine has way too much movement side to side. I've seen the half nuts, they are worn and they need to be replaced, but this does show you what an extreme amount of wear is in the half nut. Obviously, there are machines that have worse half nuts, and it's gonna depend on the pitch of the lead screw, how much movement you have. But as a comparison, my pacemaker maybe has a quarter of this movement side to side with the half nuts engaged. So it is an easy and quick way to see if they're clapped out. If it's nice and tight, you're probably fine. It's something to be aware of because sourcing half nuts is very difficult, and making them is certainly possible, but it's a little difficult. The next thing is labels, and I know a couple people are gonna laugh. Why is that its own section? It's not that critical. And in one sense that's true, but in another sense that's false. The interesting thing about labels, specifically the feeds and speeds label, is if the label is worn, you're not gonna know what feeds and speeds you're in. And that is really critical, specifically for threading. On this machine, I replaced this label because it was so worn that you couldn't tell what feed position you were in. And when you're trying to do a thread, you can kind of jumble around in the gearbox and find it, but that is pretty critical. Same thing with spindle speeds, it's a little bit less critical, but you wanna make sure that that's not worn out. You would think it'd be easy to replace, and in one sense it is, but to be honest, a lot of these machines, the manufacturers are defunct and out of business, so if you wanted to get a new plaque, good luck. Now there are some companies that make new plates. Von Industrial is top tier. They do excellent work, but getting a new plaque like this made isn't cheap. It's probably several $100s, $400 or $500. And so you may not think that it's a big deal, but you want to make sure that you can read the charts and plaques on your machine, at least the speeds and feeds chart and the spindle speeds ideally. The next thing you want to inspect is what I'm going to call minor part inspection. It's extremely common on lathes, other machine tools as well, to have handles, knobs, stuff like that broken off from forklifts, work pieces dropping on. It's a little easier to replace. It's not really a deal breaker, but you want to inspect it. Also, you want to check to see if you got zip ties holding your DRO together or handmade bracketry, stuff that's kind of rigged, not done professionally, but something you want to be aware of before you go in. There are certain aspects where if you have a handle or a knob broken, it's going to be a little bit harder to source. But for the most part, I like to look for equipment that's completely stock, meaning that there's nothing aftermarket, nothing's rigged, nothing's fixed. But if it is broken, you want to look for a good repair. As an example, I know it's hard to see, I actually broke this knob, but I repaired it. You can't really tell. Looks nice in factory. That's good. Other machines I have had similar repairs done, and it looks like a monkey did it. Again, it's not the end of the world, but you can tell a lot about the piece of equipment by who ran it. And if this breaks off and you just have a screw here, well, that's gonna tell you a lot about the operator and how he probably took care of the machine. So it's something to look out for. The last thing, and I saved it for last because it's less obvious, is missing parts. Now this is something that's pretty common on a lot of pieces of equipment, and you don't know what you don't know. Meaning if you walk up to a machine without a checklist and there's a missing part, you're probably gonna miss it. No pun intended. So we're talking anything like change gears, steady rests, follow rests, face plates, chuck keys, chuck lock wrenches that we showed earlier. All that stuff that's missing is really not ideal. Now really the hardest two things that I would say are gonna be to source is a steady rest and a follow rest. Obviously if you're missing like the top cover to the lathe or the carriage, that's gonna suck as well. But I'm assuming if it's a complete lathe, that stuff is there. I'm talking accessories wise, steady rests and follow rests suck to track down. Yes, you can buy other ones for other machines and try to retrofit them, but that's a whole nother conversation. First, make sure there's no missing actual parts. And then after that, I would say, make sure all the accessories are there. A chuck is not a big deal, but a steady rest, I've spent almost 2 years looking for a steady rest for the Lion, and it's a huge pain in the butt. So if you can get a lathe with a steady rest, please do. But obviously, don't buy a lathe if it's missing a gear in the back and it needs it, because you're gonna have a hard time finding it. So it's time to get a lathe. Where do you get one? I'm gonna give you a couple of quick options and then we'll explore each of those. So as far as websites go, we have Bidspotter, eBay, Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, Gov Deals, and obviously in person. So let's go through each of them. My favorite website by far is Bidspotter. Bidspotter takes multiple different auction houses and kind of synthesize it on their own website and allows you to search through multiple auctions. I have no affiliate with them, but I've probably bought a solid 40% of my equipment on there. It's really nice. You can see auctions that are timed, meaning there's no auctioneer, and auctions that do have an auctioneer, which are considered live. It's pretty easy to register, and anyone can buy something as long as they register, and I think you may have to have a card on file, but other than that, there's really not a lot of red tape, and there's a pretty large inventory across the entire United States and even in Canada and I think Mexico. So it's a really great website. It's where I look 90% of the time. eBay is another place where I like to buy equipment and or mostly equipment accessories. Generally, a lot of the stuff that's on eBay is overpriced because stuff is being listed as the price that people want. But here's a little secret. If you want to know what something is actually selling for, don't go on eBay and see what it's listed for, see what items have sold for. It's a special search feature that you can do. A lot of people will say, oh, I seen this machine on eBay. It was selling for $4,000. Well, yeah, that's what it's listed at. But what have other products sold for at that price? And when you search it and you find, oh yeah, they've been selling at $1,500. Well, yeah, it's not worth $4,000. That's just what someone has it posted at. But eBay is really nice because it has a very large market. So there is a lot of inventory. So you have a lot of objects to look at, which is cool. And it's well organized and it's been around for a long time. So it has a lot of great user search preferences and interface features. So I do like to look on there just in general. Marketplace is really good in terms of getting deals. I'm not going to go into it too in depth because you probably know there's a lot of tire kickers, a lot of uncertain stuff, and a lot of wading through junk on Marketplace. But because Marketplace generally kind of converts to real life, you can find the best deals on Marketplace, but you got to dig around and be patient. Craigslist is kind of coming out of favor, but in the same vein as Marketplace, some of the best deals can be found on Craigslist. That's where I found my Colchester lathe, but less and less people are using it. So the ones that are using it tend to be older and less aware that less people are using it. Sometimes you can get a good deal that way, but sometimes those same people who are unaware that a lot of people aren't using it are also unaware of the values. And I see a lot of stuff that's overpriced on Craigslist and people are really holding on to it. So just be aware of that. Gov Deals is another great website. I don't use it a lot. It's a lot of government surplus stuff, but they do have some cool stuff. A lot lower inventory for machine tools, but they do have probably 4 or 5 lathes at a time compared to Bidspotter, which maybe has 50 or 60. So it's just a good resource to check as well. And then lastly, in person. In person is absolutely the best. You can talk with the owners, you can see the machines, but searchability is the key. It's only going to be word of mouth or a newspaper ad or an ad somewhere online. So going in person and seeing something is great, but obviously it's going to be limited based on what you know. So you found a lathe and it's time to buy, but there are a couple other things in addition to the inspection that you're going to want to be aware of before you even pull the trigger. One of those things is the electrical requirements. Now, a lot of people really don't know a lot about electrical. That's okay. For the most part, electricity is fairly simple. Obviously, with anything as you go deeper, there's going to be a lot more nuance. But when it comes to lathe, the main thing you want to know is what power does the machine that you're purchasing run on? Is it going to be single phase? Is it going to be 3-phase? Is it going to be 220, 460, 480, 440, 120? Those are the type of questions that you want to know. So briefly, I want to go into each of the phases and what that means. We're not going to get too in depth, but I think it is important. So single phase is the most common here in the US for residential. That's going to be 110 or 120 volts. There's one leg or phase coming out of the wall. It's what you have in your home for the most part. Industrial machines are not going to be single phase 120, but I have seen South Bend lathes and smaller lathes, especially hobby lathes or electric DC motor lathes, be 120. So for bigger lathes, just be aware, a lot of the lights and stuff like that on machines are 120. As far as the next step up would be single phase 220. So that's going to be single phase still, but it's 220. So it has 2 legs of 120 volts. And that is going to be giving you more voltage. There are going to be a little bit more machines that are in this category, but in general, most machines are not single phase 110 or single phase 220. Having a higher voltage just allows for a little bit more current and a little bit beefier heavy duty motors, but there are going to be some lathes out there that are single phase 220. As far as residential, most homes do have single phase 220, but it's usually reserved for the dryer or the HVAC. So if you're in a garage or a smaller shop, check your panel and see what you have. Single phase 220 generally just looks like a really large normal outlet, and you're going to usually have that in a variant of a 20, 30, or 50 amp breaker. Probably the 20 or 30 amp is a little bit more common. And lastly is 3-phase. 3-phase is the standard for any industrial equipment. The main reason for that is it has 3 legs. Each leg is used in a sine wave configuration, and a 3-phase motor doesn't really require a capacitor to get the motor started. The capacitor that's used on a single-phase motor stores energy to kind of kick over the motor and make it easier to get going from the initial inertia. But in a 3-phase motor, they use one of the legs or one line of the voltage to help start the motor. So these motors are simpler because they don't have a capacitor. There are a lot less moving parts and pieces, and they're more industrial and more durable, and also cheaper as a result. So pretty much any piece of equipment that's in a factory or anything industrial is 3-phase. Generally, you're looking at 230 or 240 3-phase, or 440, 460, or 480 3-phase. Those are the 2 most common voltages here in America. But just be aware, if you're going to be buying something out of a factory and moving it into your garage, you don't have 3-phase. So there are a couple options of what you can do if you're buying a 3-phase machine and you don't have 3-phase, and we're going to get into that now. But those are the 3 breakdowns: 120, 220 single phase, and then 3-phase 230/460. The other thing I want to mention is that most 3-phase motors can be wired in 2 configurations. A lot of AC motors have the ability to be wired as a high voltage or low voltage. So 440, 480 for high, 220, 240 for low, and that's really nice. It's why AC motors are so versatile, and because there are so many AC motors compared to single-phase motors, specifically in the higher horsepower variants, are more cost effective. Now, with all that being said, if you decide to bring a machine into your shop and you don't have three-phase, where do you go from there? Well, there are three main options in terms of getting a machine running: a VFD, a rotary phase converter, and a static phase converter. So with a VFD, or a variable frequency drive, that device adds electronic features to your motor. That's the main benefit: speed control, ramp up time, ramp down time, braking time. It's a really nice unit, and you can get cheap VFDs for 50, 100 bucks, and you can get the same VFD for maybe $500. The main difference that you're paying for is long-term build quality, but more importantly, a sealed and rated unit. A cheaper VFD is not going to last very long because it's not sealed if it's in a dirty environment, and obviously being cheap has other issues. So you finally picked out that perfect machine. You figured out the electrical, you inspected it, and it's time to get it moved. So what's next? Well, rigging is what's next. And if you're anything like me, if you've never done any rigging before, or you never paid anyone to do any rigging, it's time to get surprised, because rigging is an entire thing. Now, I've learned to love rigging because it's an essential part of buying or moving any piece of machinery. So let's touch on all the different aspects of rigging, or at least what we can within this video, to kind of get your feet wet so you know what to expect when it comes to moving a lathe. So a couple things. First, rigging lathes below 10,000 pounds can be moved with a standard half-ton truck. Now, obviously I'm generalizing a little bit, but most half-ton trucks can tow 10,000 pounds. Obviously, by the time you add the trailer and all the other stuff, yeah, you guys can do the math. But if it's a small-ish or standard size lathe like we've been discussing, a 1640, 1660, 2060, most of those lathes are going to be well below 10,000 pounds. So if you want to get that thing moved, you can easily rent a trailer. If you own your own truck, you can rig that yourself. Now, loading it and unloading it's a different story that we'll get into, but at least expectation-wise, the weight of the machine is important to be aware of. Now, if you have a 10, 12, 14, 18,000 pound lathe, you're not going to be able to pull that with you or your buddy's F-150. For example, with the Lion lathe here, it was at 12,000, 14,000-ish pounds. Weight's hard to say. We needed to rent a F-250 to pull it and a gooseneck trailer. And as you get bigger machines, there'll be a point where you really need to hire someone, like with the boring mill, it had to come in on an 18-wheeler. Again, for this video, that's probably not applicable, but just to kind of give you an idea, different size machines are going to require different levels of rigging. Another thing to keep aware of is if you're wanting to move it by yourself, there's a little cheat that I like to use and other people like to use to make moving a piece of equipment more readily available for the average person. And that cheat is a drop deck trailer. Most trailers sit above the ground a foot or two, and when you get a machine loaded, that's fine, but when you get home or get to your shop, getting it unloaded can be a huge pain in the butt, even if you do have a forklift. Getting a trailer that comes all the way to the ground makes it nice and easy for unloading, because you can have the person load it at the facility, and then when you get home, you lower the trailer to the ground, and you can use machinery skates or black pipe and get the machine off safely and with minimal equipment. Now, for the most part, a drop deck trailer is going to be a little bit more difficult to rent. Here in Illinois, I only know of 2 places that rent drop deck trailers within like a 200-mile radius, but a majority of the equipment that I've moved in my shop, I've moved with that trailer. It just makes life a lot easier, it saves money, and is a little bit safer. So that's something to be aware of. Even though I'm looking like a goon wearing all these straps, there's a reason for it. When you're strapping and securing a machine, you want to make sure you know what you're doing. Now, for the most part, lifting straps, D-rings, ratchet straps, binding straps, they're really not rocket science, but you don't want to just show up with a couple 1-inch web straps and hope it's going to be fine, because it isn't. Now, ideally, when you're rigging a lathe or any piece of machinery, chain binders is preferred. Chains do not stretch, generally they do not snap, and overall they tend to be safer. But you're not always going to have that availability. So using ratchet straps can work and does work, but I'd recommend the heaviest, largest ratchet straps you can get, and always use more ratchet straps than you think. It never hurts to have an extra strap here and there. If you look at my container where I keep my ratchet straps for moving machinery, I probably have 10 to 15 of the largest kind of 18-wheeler size ratchet straps, and I use those all the time. If they get a little rip or a tear, you throw them out, but for the most part, that can do a lot of rigging, especially on anything sub like 7,000 pounds. A normal heavy-duty 3-inch wide ratchet strap can get a lot of work done. A couple of other tools that you need to be aware of when you're moving machinery is we got ratchet straps, we got eye hooks, binding straps, D-rings, tarps, toe jacks, machinery skates, machinery mover bars, 4x4s, 6x6s, heavy-duty hitches. Those are just a few things. We're gonna real briefly just go into each of those things. Depending on what you're moving, you may or may not need those. But if you haven't done this before, you're probably not thinking about all those things. You're probably thinking about truck, trailer, and straps. And there are more than just that. So first thing, straps. So when it comes to slinging, these are slinging straps. Now there's a bunch of different kinds. I'm not gonna get into too depth, but these are not for tying down a load. They're for moving a load. So I really like these style. They're a little bit more expensive, but not really too expensive. But they're really convenient for slinging. So if you want to lift a tailstock or lift a lathe, you can use a slinging strap. They also have slinging chains and slinging wire and a variety of different slinging straps. In addition to slinging straps, they also have what I'm going to call binding straps. So that'll be what we talked about, like ratchet straps or binding chains. Those are used to fasten a load. Very different. Again, ratchet straps are not a loop like these. They're loose in the end and you can ratchet a machine down. Same thing with binding straps. Usually they have a center turnbuckle that shrinks the chain, or sometimes they have a snapping feature that kind of tightens the chain up. So that is going to be for securing a load. Eye hooks are going to be what you use to fasten to a machine or parts of a machine so you can lift. A lot of these machinery have threaded holes throughout. So a lot of times shops will have a variety of eye hooks that they can basically use to rig the machine or parts of the machine. In addition, or in the same vein as eye hooks, are D-rings, shackles, clevises, and a variety of other things that do a similar thing. Basically, these allow you to join these lifting straps together or create harnesses or buckets. These are actually relatively cost-effective in this variant. So if you're going to be moving a lot of equipment, I would suggest buying a bunch of these in different sizes. Tarps, if you're moving equipment and it's not supposed to rain, it almost always rains. Sometimes you want to tarp a machine, sometimes tarping it creates a lot of issues. Tarp blows off, it rips. So you just got to be aware of how far you're going, how tight you wrap the tarp. The best thing to do if you are going to tarp a machine is tarp it and then saran wrap it. That keeps the tarp from coming off. But every machine that I've ever tarped, I've almost always damaged the tarp, usually because I'm going a long distance. But if it's gonna rain, there is a benefit in tarping. However, if you're gonna go without tarping, there's also benefits in addition to not ripping the tarp and having the tarp fly off and hit someone's car. But it just keeps things aerodynamic and it's a smoother load. Make sure that you go ahead and WD-40 and seal what you're moving. And for the most part, it'll be fine. If you're moving a lathe and there's a little rain and you coat it before you move and you get there and you wipe it down, it'll probably be fine. But obviously, if it's pouring, that's not ideal. So just keep that in mind. Toe jacks. Toe jacks are like the unsung hero of rigging. Toe jacks can come under any piece of machinery and kind of have a little toe, and it's a bottle jack with a toe. So it can help lift up a corner of a lathe, for example, so you can position a dolly or move it or slide it, and they're super handy. Ideally, you'd have them in multiple sizes, but they can be pretty pricey, so getting some used toe jacks is probably not a bad idea if you're trying to save a couple bucks. Machinery skates. Machinery skates are the -- way to move any piece of heavy equipment over a long distance, especially without a forklift. Basically, it's a dolly for machinery. They're very heavy duty and are really nice for heavy equipment. Problem is they are very expensive. They do make a cheap version of machinery skates, many different options, but generally they are not very good. I have the high quality ones on my lathe right now and they are perfect, but they're also about $2,000 for a set of 4. I've owned the cheap ones and they really aren't that great. If you're in a pinch, get the cheap ones, just be aware they're not that good. They don't typically rotate and they're likely to slide out, which is dangerous, so keep an eye on them. But machinery skates are really good specifically for moving machinery on smooth surfaces. They don't work on bad concrete or dirt, so just be aware of that. Machinery moving bars are another cost-effective and great way to move machinery, and kind of in conjunction with machinery skates. Basically, they're a long bar, kind of like a Johnson bar, and a lot of times they have wheels on the back. You can actually go up to a machine that's 5,000 or 6,000 pounds and lift a corner of that machine because it has like a 7-foot long handle. And otherwise, you can use the back end of the handle to kind of move a machine on machinery skates by yourself. So it's just basically a giant pry bar with some wheels, but it's worth looking into. 4x4s and 6x6s. Now, anytime you go and get a piece of machinery, a lot of times they set it on the trailer on 4x4s or 6x6s, because if you're forking something, you can't bring it all the way to the ground, or else you're not going to be able to get the fork clips out. So if you're going somewhere, it would be smart to have 4x4s on hand. I like to bring little offcuts of 4x4s, but sometimes they have 4x4s where you're going, and it'd just be good to have 4x4s or 6x6s around anyway. I have some pressure treated 4x4s I just keep on hand. You never know when you're going to need to stack something up, and it really makes it easier if you're taking it off with a forklift at your shop to make sure it is on 4x4s. It just allows you to either get a toe jack or a bar or anything else under the lathe. If it's sitting directly on the deck, it's just going to be a huge pain in the butt. And then heavy duty hitches are one of the last things. If you're not thinking about this, and a lot of people aren't, and you're using your F-150 and you're towing big loads, or even a 250, a lot of basic cheap Curt hitches technically will work, but a nicer hitch with a higher rating really is ideal, and especially a hitch with adjustable height. I have a really expensive Gen Y hitch that I bought even before I owned a truck, so that way when I rented different vehicles, I could adjust the hitch height. That's really important to make sure that your load is properly balanced, and also you don't want to make sure that your hitch breaks and you lose your load. Probably not going to happen, but a higher quality hitch just gives you extra security when you're doing that. A couple other tips on rigging. Before you purchase any machine from an auction, it's wise to call a rigger and get a quote. Sometimes that's not always possible, and as you get better at buying equipment, you'll get a rough idea of what it costs to move something. However, rigging can always surprise you, especially in the beginning. I can't tell you the amount of equipment that I've bought without getting a quote. I get a quote, and sometimes it's more than the machine that I paid for. Obviously, with experience, you learn that over time, but if you have no idea what rigging costs, you don't want to be shocked, especially on one of your first purchases. So do the due diligence and call a rigger or call a couple of riggers and get a quote. A lot of these bidding websites on Bidspotter list a rigger in the description, so you don't have to shoot in the dark. You can give them a call. But don't just trust one rigger. Get multiple estimates. A lot of times in the beginning, I would just use the rigger that they list, and they would be really expensive, and I would just go with it. But a lot of times there are riggers that are willing to do things for cheaper prices or give you better deals, so it's best to shop around. The other thing is when you're rigging a load, whether it's yourself or someone else, it's always better to sling the load from above. What I mean by that is if you're gonna pick up a lathe from the bottom with forks, that's fine. It's not the end of the world. But if you can pick it from the top and hang it, it's a lot safer. If you have a heavy load on forks from below and you hit a bump with the forklift, it's possible that the load could tip. Whereas if you're slinging it from above, it takes a little bit more work to set up, but it's nice because the load will just swing. But as a general rule, I try to sling things from above if possible, because it generally is a little bit safer. Also, if you're renting a trailer, a pro tip is make sure you get a spare. Most trailer rental places have spares because they service their own equipment, but they don't include them with the trailer because most people don't ask. Ask for a spare. Ask me how I know that. You may need it, and you're going to be glad that you carried a spare around that you didn't need than if you're in the middle of nowhere with a 30,000 pound piece of equipment and you blow out a tire. Trust me, it's no fun. The other thing to be aware of is when you're renting a trailer, a lot of places will not rent to you if you have a Jeep Wrangler or SUV. They have an algorithm that they use, specifically U-Haul I'm thinking of, where you put in the load and what you're towing, and they have a calculator that will tell you if the vehicle will do it. Now the problem is there's certain vehicles, like for example a Jeep Wrangler or an SUV, that do have a tow rating of 7,500 or 5,000, but a lot of these places won't rent to them because a Jeep Wrangler is a shorter vehicle and is just a little bit more unsafe, but you can still do it. Just be aware of that. So if you go to rent a trailer, you know what vehicle you have and you know the likelihood if they're gonna rent to you. Obviously, if it's a pickup, you know, like a full size, it'll probably be fine. But even certain models and submodels, they will allow you tow a certain amount with that. So just be aware that that's a feature and that's something that can kind of come out and surprise you. Knowing the weights and dimensions of any piece of equipment before you buy it is really important, whether you're buying it on an auction or in person, especially if you're going to be rigging it with another company. That's the first question they're gonna ask you. What machine is it? What are the dimensions and what does it weigh? And if you're gonna be doing it yourself, you need to know how heavy it is so you can know what type of trailer to get. So if you're looking at an auction and they don't have that, a lot of times you can call and they'll have a runner go over there and measure the item for you. Sometimes if they're not willing to do that, you can take the model, look it up, and you can go on Vintage Machinery or a manufacturer's website and try to get a rough idea. But it's important to know that stuff before you bid or before you buy something from someone's place, so that way you know how you're gonna go and get that piece of equipment. In general, getting a piece of equipment loaded is more important than getting it unloaded. Here's what I mean. So a lot of places will load or have a rigger load it for you on your own trailer. But if you own your own trailer and you bring it back to your shop, you can park it and come back the next day and take a day or two to unload it. Whereas a lot of these places have a lot of equipment they're trying to rig in a single day. So they're not gonna be there while you try to mess around and load it up for 4 or 5 hours. So if you're pressed for cash and you can only afford to pay a rigger once, I would say pay a rigger to load it. They're gonna load it efficiently and you can take your time unloading it when you get home. But they don't have the patience if you show up to load your own equipment at a lot of these auctions and you're messing around with black pipes. They're not gonna allow any of that to fly at a typical auction. These are just a couple of the many rigging tips that are out there. And if you're gonna be serious about moving equipment, I would really do some good research online. There are a lot of excellent YouTube series by rigging companies that you can go and educate yourself with. I just wanted to hit a couple of the main points because for most people, rigging is an afterthought, and it's probably one of the biggest safety things when it comes to machinery, aside from operating it, especially that gets overlooked. So do your due diligence and research and know what you're gonna do when it comes to rigging. The good news is a lot of these machines, especially anything sub 10,000 pounds, you guys can do it on your own and you can save money, but you gotta do a little bit of research and know what you're doing. Otherwise, it can be a huge disaster. You got the perfect lathe picked out, you figured out the electrical, you got the rigging squared away, and it's on its way back to your shop. You're pretty much there. But there's one last thing in terms of preparation that a lot of people overlook in terms of getting a lathe in place, and that is the concrete. Now, for most garages in the US, most garages have a 4-inch slab, and for most equipment under 5, 6, 7,000 pounds, that's completely fine. Most industrial facilities have slabs that are 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 inches deep, and that's gonna be a lot more suited for heavier equipment. But knowing what concrete you have, where you're putting your machinery, is important, specifically when it comes to a lathe. And the reason is lathes are long in nature, and they're designed to do long precision work. So when you span a lathe across multiple concrete joints, the accuracy of that lathe can be compromised if you're not aware of what your concrete situation is. So here's some quick kind of points to be aware of when it comes to concrete. The first one we kind of already touched on, but most 10,000 pound and less machinery is fine sitting on a 4-inch slab. However, the thicker the slab, the better for the machinery and to minimize cracking. Specifically, when it comes to concrete, you need to worry about PSI, or pounds per square inch. If you take 10,000 pounds and put it on 1 square inch, that's 10,000 pounds in one area on 4,000 PSI, you're gonna break the concrete. But if you take that same weight and distribute it between 20 points, it's entirely different. So the thicker the slab, the better, but a way around that is to have more points of contact. On most equipment, you're not gonna be able to increase the contact points because the leveling bolts are fixed, but what you can do is have leveling feet that increases the diameter of the contact point, so that can help get around some thinner concrete. So if you're building your shop, I would build a shop with a thicker slab, but if you're an existing shop, you're just gonna have to work with what you got. Ideally, a lathe should not be set up straddling multiple concrete joints. Now, this isn't always possible, especially on larger lathes, but for the most optimal setup, it's best that the lathe is on its own slab. One way you can kind of mitigate that if that's not possible is by continually leveling your lathe. For example, if your lathe is on multiple joints, maybe once a month you can go around and just kind of dial it in. It isn't gonna be a lot of movement, but the concrete does move, and that is gonna affect the twist and level of the lathe. So if you can't get it on one solid slab, just be aware that you're gonna need to level it a little bit more frequently. Another controversial point, but is really important, is leveling the machine and bolting it down. A lot of equipment has 2 holes where the leveling bolts are, one for the bolt and one for the anchor. It is additional work, but if you can bolt and level the machine, it's gonna create a much more rigid, vibration-free experience. Ideally, what you would do is position the machine, mark the holes, slide the machine out of the way, drill the holes, put the machine back and tap in the anchors, make sure everything is level, and then bolt it down, check the level, and adjust the screws so that way the lathe is bolted and leveled. It is a lot of additional work. Not all lathes are set up with 2 holes, but if you can do it, you should do it because it does really cut down on some added vibration. When it comes to anchoring a lathe or any machine, make sure you get quality anchors. There is a huge difference between the cheap pound-in anchors and the expensive ones. In the beginning, I was just buying the cost-effective ones, but a lot of those tend to pull out and lose torque over time. The high-quality Hilti and Redhead ones and even the epoxy ones really are more expensive but are well worth the investment. In addition to the anchors, it's going to be wise to probably own or rent a rotary drill. Usually a 3/4 inch or 1 inch bit is going to do for most equipment, but it's something a lot of people don't consider, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of machinery fastening. You can rent those drills pretty cost effectively, but just be aware you're not going to go up to a 4-inch slab and drill a 1-inch hole in concrete with a standard rotary hammer drill. It's also good to have a rotary hammer drill on hand so that you can drill these anchors in the floor. A lot of times you're going to be using a 3/4 inch or a 1-inch hole, and you're not going to be able to take a standard drill and drill through a 4-8-inch slab. You're going to need an actual rotary hammer. If you're doing a lot of equipment, it's probably a good investment to pick one up, but they are pretty cheap if you need to rent them for a one-time use. And the last point I'll make about concrete is ideally machinery or any lift or anything like that should not be installed on cracked concrete. Now again, we're talking ideal. I have a couple pieces of equipment installed in cracked concrete and it's fine. But cracked concrete is no different than a concrete joint, and specifically with a lathe, if you're installing it over a crack, it's similar to installing it over a joint, so you just have to be more aware of the leveling and be on top of that. Otherwise, you're gonna have your lathe move and not realize it. Well, it really depends on how long you wanna keep it. To be honest, any equipment will last forever. The big determining factor is how much money do you wanna put into it to keep it running. Most people will operate a lathe as long as possible. The one thing that really knocks a lathe out and kills it is bed wear. Once the bed gets too worn, for most people, fixing that is too expensive and they part ways with the machine. But a properly maintained lathe, especially a new one to you or a used one with minimal bed wear, can really last forever. This is a question I got from a viewer. How important really is the lathe bed wear? to be honest, for most people, it's not that big of a deal. Every machine in this shop that's a lathe has bed wear, varying levels between 0.5 thousandths and 7 thousandths, and all of those machines produce great parts all the time. Now, you do need to be aware if you have a lathe and you're doing long parts and you have a 7, 20 thousandths, 30 thousandths dip in the middle, you're not going to be able to turn a long shaft accurately. However, most work that you do is short, and even if it's a long part, it's a section of the part that you're doing. So for most applications, bed wear is not as big of a deal as people make of it. However, where I think that bed wear is a bigger deal is the usability of a machine. Machines that are super worn out, 20, 30 thousandths in the middle, are kind of a pain to use because they're super loose in the middle, and then in the end, they're really tight, and it's kind of a pain to use, and you're always wondering if you can quite trust the machine. Ideally, a new machine with no wear is really nice, but for the most part, a lot of jobs aren't coming in where you're doing 8 or 10 foot long rips within a half thousandths tolerance. A lot of those jobs are better suited for OD grinding anyway. So I think lathe wear is a big deal, but I do think for most people and most jobs, it is a little bit overblown. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but for the most part, I would get as fast of a spindle speed as you can. Carbide does like to run quick. However, a lot of guys out there are saying you can't run carbide anything slower than 1500. That may be true based on the surface feet, but we also have to keep in mind a lot of these guys are trying to optimize carbide, run it efficiently. A lot of the home shop or small shop guys don't care about optimization. They just want to know what will work. You can run carbide extremely slow and it will work. It's just not efficient. So obviously I would get the lathe with the highest RPM, and I would avoid lathes with a really slow RPM. But for the most part, RPM similar to bed wear really seems to be an overblown topic. I would just avoid like an old machine that has a max RPM of like 600. But a lot of newer equipment in the last 30, 40 years has a spindle speed over 1,000, and in that case, I think you're going to be fine. You get a machine in your shop, what are the common repairs if you didn't get to inspect it that you may be in for? So I would say lead screws, bronze nuts, knobs, motors, belts, oil cleaning, bad coolant pumps. Those are some of the most common things in terms of repairs on lathes. We already kind of touched on it, but lathes are relatively simple machines. So a lot of those things we just mentioned, if you swap it out, the machine is probably going to be fine. And those are some of the most typical things to go wrong. Ideally, a steady rest is number one on my list. If you can get it with a steady rest, make sure you can. It's not always possible. I would say out of the 3 machines that I have, I only was able to get 2, actually 1 with a steady rest. The Colchester, I was able to source a steady rest and a follow rest, but that's a pretty common machine. You can go on eBay right now and find steady rest and follow rest for that machine, but you can't for the pacemaker, and you certainly can't for the Lion. So I would try to get those accessories if possible. Chucks, a 3-jaw and a 4-jaw is what you want. 6-jaw is nice, but not required. If you can only get one, make sure it's a 4-jaw. A 3-jaw is more efficient, but a 4-jaw has more versatility. But those chucks you can really get afterwards. And then a faceplate, sometimes you use it. It's very minimal, but make sure you get it if you can or if it's available. Sometimes these equipment have these parts or pieces, but they're in a corner somewhere or they're not in the lot with the machine. Sometimes they're sold separately to get more money, but sometimes you just gotta ask and really pry because the parts are there, they're just sitting over in the corner. So when you're going in to buy a machine, if it's there, make sure you're getting it when you purchase the machine. So what type of tooling do you need to run a machine? Now I'm gonna go over the tooling that I'm using on the Colchester. This is by no means what you need. I've been trying to build this tooling collection over the last 3 years. So if you're starting out, it's gonna be much smaller than this, but I'm gonna briefly go through what I use on a daily basis so you can kind of see what other people are using. First and foremost, when you buy a machine, the first thing that you should buy is a tool post. There are expensive ones and cheap ones. You get what you pay for. Having a good tool post is going to be way better than using a 4-way style or a lantern style. So that would be the first thing you want to get or make sure it has. In terms of turning tools, if you have a traditional tool post like this, you're going to have tool holders, and in each of those holders you're going to have individual turning tools. Real briefly, I'm going to touch on what we have here. So we have 2 or 3 different turning tools for typical turning and facing operations: a CNMG, a DNMG, and a CCMT insert. I use those 3 pretty frequently. You're going to want some sort of parting device. I have 2 different parting tools. I have a tang grip, and I don't remember what this one's called, but it's for a shorter grooving and parting. You're also going to want something to do chamfering. I have an ID chamfering tool and an OD chamfering tool. You're going to need something for threading. I have a high-speed option and a carbide top-notch option. You're going to want something for boring, different boring bars from small to big. And then past that, you're going to have some additional items, like I got a button insert, we have a knurling tool in the back, but those items will pretty much cover you on basic turning, parting, facing, grooving, chamfering, etc. When it comes to chucks, adapters, that sort of thing, really you probably only need 2, to be honest. You need a chuck, either a keyless chuck or a keyed chuck, and you need a live center. I personally like the keyed chucks better. They grip better. They're a little bit more time consuming to set up, but the Jacob Super Chucks tend to be a recommendation that I have. As far as centers, a nice center really is important. It doesn't need to be a Bison or a Royal. They're very expensive, but you don't want a cheap center. A cheap center is going to move and deflect, and you're going to get chatter when you're using it. I have a couple different centers back here. They have lower profile centers, which allow you to get tighter into the work, or CNC centers, and traditional ones, which generally have a higher load rating but are a little bit more stout and beefy and have less clearance. And then on this lathe, I have some ER40 taper options for the quill, and also up here for tapping and a floating tap holder. That's kind of a luxury, but as far as tooling goes, that's kind of a basic overview of what you may need when you purchase a lathe or when you get a lathe up and running long term. Do you really need more than one lathe? I would say so. To be honest, I'm a machine shop, and any machine shop is going to have 3 to 25 lathes. But for most people, you can get by with one lathe. I enjoy machine tools, and for that reason, having multiple machines is beneficial for different operations. Obviously, 3 lathes is better than 1, 2 lathes is better than 1. But if you can only get 1, I would try to get a lathe that can do multiple duties. If you know your shop is only going to be able to have 1 lathe and you get a miniature lathe but you want to do big work, that's going to be a problem. Same thing goes in the opposite direction. If you have a lot of space and you get a huge lathe but you're making a bunch of small pins, it's probably possible, but it's going to suck. So in that case, you're going to want to get a big lathe and a small lathe. But really, it just depends on what your shop has availability for in terms of space and obviously budget. Oh man, this is an interesting one. You know, I think the way that I would answer this question has a lot to do with nostalgia. I would say a pacemaker, a Lion lathe, like a newer one, and maybe a Monarch 61 series pacemaker. I love that machine. It looks amazing. It runs amazing. And it's just a stout machine. The Monarch 61 series, Aaron Durda has one. It's a beautiful machine. Ever since I laid eyes on that, I've always wanted one of those. Should I get one? No. It's not really gonna work for what my business is trying to do. The spindle bore is too small, but it's a nice looking machine. And obviously the best case for my business would be a newer style machine, having those metric threading, bigger spindle bore, and other features we talked about. And in that case, if someone handed me 100 grand, I'd go out and buy a brand new Lion machine. In terms of manufacturers today, they are what I feel is the best available to me here in the States in terms of quality machines being made today. So if I had 100 G's, I'd go out and buy a brand new, larger Lion lathe. We already kind of touched on this, but the main deal breakers would really be a worn out bed, bad headstock gear, main bearings, noisy headstock, missing major parts like a tailstock carriage or other hard to get parts. We touched on this a little bit before, but what are some green flags and some red flags when buying a lathe? Some green flags are a small shop or home shop owned, a machine that is clean, original paint, manuals with the machine, no modifications, an owner operator present, specifically one that tells stories or talks about using the machine, no rust on the machine, a machine that's under power and wired up, and tooling on rags like we previously talked about. Some red flags, just real briefly, are a big messy shop, a small shop that's grungy and dusty and dirty with greasy equipment, machinery that's not under power and can't be tested, poor pictures, no videos, broken handles, buttons, crappy modifications, machinery buried in the back corner of a building, poor lighting, and someone who doesn't know the history of the machine or has no knowledge of the equipment. This is another question that we got. What are some lathes to avoid? I wouldn't get a monster engine lathe that turns at 300 or 600 RPM. It's probably not gonna be of much use. I wouldn't buy a turret lathe unless you're doing a specific repeat job. I wouldn't get a lathe missing a steady rest. I wouldn't buy a Monarch 10EE unless you're an electrical wizard, and I'll caveat that. The 10EE is an excellent machine, but due to the Reeves drives and the double DC motor for most people, if you're getting your first machine, that's gonna be a pretty difficult learning curve. So just be aware of that, and for that reason, I wouldn't recommend it as a first machine. I wouldn't get a flat belt lathe or a lathe with plain bearings. For the most part, this is just old equipment, early 1900s, but anything that's flat belt driven or has a plain bearing, not that you can't make good parts, but there is a limit to the type of cuts you're taking, and I would just overall steer away from that. You can get a lot of other great machines that don't have those features, so I would avoid that. I wouldn't have a lathe that doesn't have a separate power feed shaft. This is a little bit more niche, but specifically on smaller lathes or Chinese lathes, sometimes they ditch the power feed shaft and they use the power feed off of the lead screw. I would avoid that. There are other cheap import lathes that have a feed screw, so there's no reason why you should get a lathe missing one, or a feed rod. So I would just avoid lathes that are missing that feed rod. And I wouldn't get a lathe with a really short bed. Again, back to the length of the lathe. For a standard like 1460 or 1660 lathe, I wouldn't get a lathe with a short bed, like a 30 or a 20. It really cuts you down when it really cuts the work that you can do down. And when you add the tailstock and your extensions and your drill bits, you really shrink shorter and shorter. And for that reason, if you're gonna go through the work of getting a lathe, getting one that's an extra foot or two longer, it just makes sense. So don't get a short lathe bed. Yeah, there's actually some really great resources online for old equipment and old lathes. A couple that come to mind, vintagemachinery.org is the best resource in my opinion for old equipment in general. It's a website that Keith Rucker basically invented. It has all the old manuals and indexes, and it has pictures and photos and forums. That is your #1 place to go to if you have questions or want to find info on old equipment. Lathes.uk.co, I believe it is an awesome website. Has a lot of info on lathes and the lathe manufacturers, a lot of history. There's like a main page where you can click on each manufacturer and it tells you like a story. And aside from that, you can get on the Practical Machinist forum and YouTube, and obviously you guys know that. Small lathes, let's talk about them. I know you think I have a vendetta against little lathes, and I really don't. Just for what I'm doing, a smaller lathe doesn't make a lot of sense, but there are a lot of benefits to a smaller lathe, either a benchtop lathe, an import lathe, or just a miniature hardened style lathe. So let's jump right in. To list a couple small lathe brands, Logan, South Bend, Shoreline, Myford, Sheldon, and Little Machine Shop come to mind, as well as Precision Matthews. A lot of those are import machines. Some of them are actually European made, but those are some brands that I can think of off the top of my head. Logan and South Bend are American made, and a lot of hobby guys really love those machines. They look like really nice machines. I don't personally have any experience with them. Shoreline makes a really high quality lathe, but it is a very small lathe, maybe even like watchmaker size, but it's high quality. Myford, I believe, is in the UK or Britain, and that's a quality lathe, and I know that they also have a lathe mill combo. Sheldon, they make lathes kind of smaller up to medium size. Little Machine Shop is a great resource for very small lathes. When I was first starting out, I was gonna buy a lathe from them. They kind of specialize in benchtop lathes, and they do something similar as Precision Matthews, where they really try to curate the product. They work with the manufacturers to kind of extract more value out of the typical small lathe compared to a lot of other manufacturers. With a lot of small lathes, they do a lot of similar manufacturing techniques. So when you look at the Harbor Freight lathes, the Sieg lathe, the Little Machine Shop lathe, the castings are all very similar. So it's one shop in China or Taiwan cranking them out and different people rebadging them. Same with the Grizzly. And at that lower price point, you know, sub $1,000, sub $1,500, they share a lot of components. But Little Machine Shop has gone in and sort of worked with the manufacturer to get different motors and different setups. And so if I was gonna buy a really small benchtop lathe, even though it's a little bit more money, I'd probably err with Little Machine Shop or Precision Matthews for that reason. And then Precision Matthews we talked about earlier. Their bigger stuff is higher quality because there's more budget obviously, but some of the small stuff is there as well. So yeah. There are a lot of benefits to owning a smaller lathe. The main thing is space. There's a lot of people that have a smaller garage or shop and they just do not have the space for a smaller lathe. There is also a really big wealth of hobby content out there on YouTube. Some of my favorite channels are Artisan Makes, Blondie Hacks, just to name a few, specifically for small lathes. There is a load of really cool content out there. I think just because it's a little bit more accessible. But overall, small machinery is no better or worse than large machinery. It's just suited for a different task. So you can do similar work on small machines. You just don't have the power or rigidity, so you have to go a little bit slower. If you don't have the space for a big machine, a small machine is gonna be perfect. But just be aware that you're not going to be able to be making heavy cuts, hogging material like you can on a big lathe. Just be aware of the limitations. The other thing to be aware of with smaller lathes is there is a lot more poor quality on the market with a lot of expensive larger machines because the price point is higher. There tends to be a higher bar for quality, and the reverse is true with lower quality small machines. Because the machines are small, the budgets are lower, and for the most part, it's harder to find small lathe manufacturers that are manufacturing at a higher quality. Most of the manufacturers are making small lathes because they're marketing to people who can't afford larger lathes. So the lathes tend to be of lower quality. There are a couple manufacturers that do specialize in higher quality small lathes. Shoreline is one that comes to mind, and there's another couple companies that make like precision small lathes. But to be honest, just be aware that there are a lot of junk small lathes out there. So just know that that's a thing that you're gonna have to navigate if you're looking at buying a small lathe. Another thing with small lathes is you're probably gonna buy a newer small lathe. Small lathes are cheap enough where there's really not a lot of point to buy one used. You can go out and get a benchtop lathe for $1,000 brand new, or $1,500, or even $2,000. Sure, you can get one for $500 less used, but you don't know what condition it's in. So buying a newer one makes a lot more sense than buying a newer, larger lathe, where that could be $100,000 or $50,000. So just be aware of that. Something that a lot of people neglect is how important it is to know yourself when you're buying a lathe or any piece of equipment. Are you someone that wants to buy once and cry once, or are you someone that just cares about the bottom dollar? As an example, I know that I'm OCD and I know that I like certain brands. So if I bring in a brand that I'm not gonna like, or the machine isn't where I want it to be, I know that I'm not gonna be happy. But other people are less particular. Knowing that before you make your purchase, although it seems obvious, is really important, especially for a long-term satisfaction. These machines don't move easily. They're hard to move, they're expensive, and ideally when you move a machine in, you don't want to move it back out because it's the wrong machine. Being able to know what you want and what you like and what you need is important to ensure that that doesn't happen. Also, planning for the future and knowing, is this a long-term hobby or is it supposed to be turning into a business? If it's just a hobby, it's gonna be really hard to justify these expensive purchases, and you're gonna need to make more compromises. If you're gonna turn it into a business, or that's your plan, it's gonna be a little bit easier to justify making a newer purchase or purchasing something that's more expensive, because you're gonna be generating revenue. So that's something that you wanna consider. Something else that may not be entirely obvious is how much risk can you take on? Now, if anyone out there is married, they know that when they go to their spouse and ask them to buy a $20,000 or $30,000 piece of equipment, it may not be the funnest conversation, but everyone is in a different situation. If you're single and you're full of money, you're gonna be able to take on less risk than if you're married, you're 40 or 50, and you're trying to plan for retirement. Again, it may seem obvious, but knowing yourself and what situation you are in life is gonna help you assess how much risk you can take on. If you move in a $20,000 piece of equipment and it ends up being a pile of scrap, can you take that risk on, or do you 100% need that machine to be perfect with no chance or risk of it being a failure? That's extremely important to be aware of before you take the jump and bring a machine into your shop. I would much rather take a low quality machine in excellent condition than buy a Monarch that's completely worn out. Quality and condition are both important, but as with anything, you're gonna need to compromise on either of those things and synthesize that with cost to see what's gonna work for your budget. Knowing the right time to buy a machine is really important in terms of taking on risk and knowing if you're ready or when you should buy a machine. Personally, I've brought 3 or 4 machines in here and then sent them out on scrap or sold them because they just were the wrong machine. And when you're doing this, that's common. But the more you can cut down on machinery coming in and leaving because it's the wrong machine, the better. So before you jump into a machinery purchase, the best thing you can do is educate yourself. Watching this video is gonna be a great primer, but if anything, it's designed to really help you figure out what you don't know so that you can go into that area and do more research. Once you've become comfortable with what you don't know and what you do know, then you're gonna be in a lot better position to pull that trigger and buy that machine. Now, the last step of this video is really exciting. We're gonna move into the office and I'm gonna pull up an auction website and we're gonna go through a mock purchase. I haven't looked at any of the lathes on that website, but we're gonna go through and I'm gonna be verbally processing as I look at each machine on what I think, what I like, what I don't, and hopefully that'll kind of help some of you guys see the thought process that I go through when I'm trying to buy a machine. Got our web browser pulled up and we're on Bidspotter. We're gonna go through the process of looking for a lathe. So we're gonna come over here in the search bar and just type in lathe. And these are gonna be all the lathes on Bidspotter's website. So it's anything throughout the country. And again, we're looking for a standard size lathe. So let's grab this first one here and take a look at it. Looks like a good size. It's a sharp. No bids yet. Let's open this photo up. All right, so originally looks pretty good. Nothing too crazy. We got a little bit of wear right here on the plaque, not a big deal. It looks like a variable speed. So it has a VFD controlling the speed. Overall, looks like a really nice machine. We can't tell anything about wear from this photo. We see a lot of brass chips, so that's a good sign. No broken handles or nothing. The digital readout looks pretty old. Let's see. Spindle bore looks decent. It's not huge, but it looks, you know, rather large for the size. 2.5 inch, 3 inch. And the spindle speeds, I cannot read, maybe 2,000. So that looks good. Overall, not a lot of photos on this one, but looks like this could be a decent lathe. I would love to see more pictures, but let's move on. Master turn 1500 here. We'll take a look at this one. All right, now this lathe is actually a Colchester. Clausing and Colchester kind of use this design, and other people like Master Turn and Turn Master, even though it's a variation of the name. Even other manufacturers have kind of bought out this casting design. So even though it's a Master Turn, a lot of these lathes are similar. They are pretty decent lathes. Let's take a look, see what we see that jumps out. So it's a little dirty, a little grimy, not the end of the world. We do have some plastic down there, which is kind of nice. Maybe they use this a lot on plastic, or maybe it's just the last job they did. Let's see what close-ups we have. We have wood floors, which is kind of nice. The ways look a little grimy, and there's like a random block of wood there, and some stuff kind of strewn about on the tailstock. The chuck looks pretty well worn. I really don't like these one-piece jaws, but hey, you know, some people use those. This looks fine, nothing too noteworthy there. Just showing us the label, which doesn't matter. Can't really tell. There's no major scoring or marking on the way, so that's good. But a visual inspection in person would be better. That's a nice Jacobs Super Chuck. That center looks like it's well worn. And this chuck is pretty junk, but that looks like a good 18 in right there. The tooling does have its own rack, which is really nice. But these handles looks like that's welded and this is bent. So, you know, that tells you a little bit about the user. Oh, look, we have some, oh, these are still one piece, but there are extra jaws. And we do see a lot of high-speed tooling, just random tooling. This is pretty typical. It's not the worst. It's not the best. It's probably middle of the road. And we have a steady rest, which is great. Faceplate, and looks like it's a cam lock, which is nice. And it looks like maybe a Chinese chuck 4-jaw. And some more tooling. Some of this doesn't go with the lathe, but there's a follow rest down there, which is great. Maybe some change gears. That looks like a Bridgeport R8 90-degree attachment. Probably other junk in this that they're just including with the auction. Yeah, I think that's what that is, a Bridgeport adapter. That looks like a 5C collet closer. If it goes with that lathe, that'd be pretty nice. And they're including that. This kind of looks like it's in Europe. I don't know why I'm thinking that. Maybe I saw that. Ontario, Canada. Okay. Yeah, this looks like a nice machine. If this goes cheap, probably be a pretty decent machine. I'm thinking cost-wise, I wouldn't pay more than 3 or 4 G's US for it. But, you know, something like this could go for as little as $2 grand, and if that case, it'd be a decent deal. But if it was like 5, 6, 7, I probably wouldn't go for it. Let's see what else we got. The South Bend, this will be interesting here. So this one's a little bit of a rougher lathe, but what I like about this one is we have some really detailed pictures. Most of the photos that people take are low resolution. This is high resolution. A nice high resolution photo can tell you a lot. This paint is looking pretty rough, but that doesn't mean much. Here's the first thing we see is it has one feed rod / lead screw, and this is what I told you to avoid. It's basically using this feed screw to do the power traverse and feed as well as threading. So this screw is going to take a lot more wear. We do see flame hardened bedways, which is good, but we'll take a look here. Yeah, this lathe is in pretty rough shape. It kind of looks like it's sitting outside. I would say it's outside based on the lighting. It looks super bright. Machinery being outside is really not ideal. Let's go back to that photo. Overall, nothing crazy. A little bit of wear on the compound. I've seen worse. Looks like an off-brand tool post and some sheet metal bent up stuff over on the taper attachment. But overall, not too bad. Let's see. We have a chuck with 2-piece jaws, which is good. I don't know if that's a bison symbol. It doesn't look like it. Might be an import chuck. Looks like we have a real basic speed, or this is a neutral, and then maybe high speed, low speed. And then maybe we have a variable speed. I can't tell. It looks like there's a load meter, a forward, reverse, and a stop. And we have the back cover exposed, which is not ideal. You can see the back of the lathe. The peeling paint doesn't bother me. What bothers me is this specific lathe. It's not too high quality, you can tell, because it's missing that separate feed rod. The electronics are kind of an afterthought on top and are missing that cover. Overall, yeah, it kind of here shows you here. See this black on the wires. May be an issue. It just may be degrading. Either way, I would stray away from that. This lathe is in rough shape, and this is a good opportunity to kind of just say I would probably steer away from a lathe like this. This probably will go cheap though, so if you really wanted a beater lathe or a lathe you can do some welding on, maybe this would be a good one for that. Let's see what else we got. The other thing to keep in mind on Bidspotter, a lot of these lathes are going to be priced low, $25, $200, $25. Most of this stuff goes up in price right on the last day. So when you see this stuff, don't jump on it. Register, watch it. But I only probably win about 10% of the items I bid on seriously, because stuff just shoots up right at the last minute. So deals can be had, but just keep in mind that what you see is probably not what you're going to get. Here's a jet lathe. Let's take a look at this. All right, good size, 1440. Maybe some rust or something here. Let's see. These pictures are blurry. Blurry is not ideal. Let's see. We have a Loris tool post, so that's nice. Let's see. Looks like it's in a shop that's being used, which is good. That chuck, I can't read the label, but it isn't damaged too much. 2-piece jaw, so that's good. You can kind of tell these jaws are pretty worn, so it's probably seen a lot of use. They're kind of rounded. Newer jaw chucks or chuck jaws are very sharp and crisp. New all digital readout. New all is pretty expensive. They do have different lines, but this is good. Good to see. Excuse me. And then we have the spindle speeds, 1800, nice and fast, so that's good. And you can just kind of tell by the font on this labeling that this machine is most likely made in Taiwan. And it's probably just a rebranded other machine, but that's okay. We have a D1, or a cam lock style spindle, which is good. Chuck keys, that's good to see. Yep, China right there. So I said Taiwan, China's even worse. There you go. And then this kind of shows you what we're working with. We have 3-phase, and then it can be wired in either direction. And then we're back to the original. This machine might be a good machine. Overall, it depends on what it's going to go for. Probably 3, 4, 5 Gs would be sufficient. It has a nice foot brake, and it has stops for the carriage. Be nice if this lathe was a little longer. But overall, it looks like a pretty decent machine. No major red flags. Has a little bit of tooling included, looks like. And I did like that new all readout. So overall, it's a good machine. Kind of interested about this hydraulic press in the background, but that's a different story. Let's see what else we got. Trying to look for a standard size. Let's grab this pacemaker. It's big, but maybe be a good example. All right, whoops, what happened there? Let's try that again. Here we go. Looking for something with a lot of pictures. All right, so this is a great example of a pacemaker. Super old, super dirty. A lot of them are. Yeah, super grungy photos. Yeah, the chuck is rusted. It's probably a Cushman chuck, probably original. I don't see the circular nameplate, but a rusted chuck like this still is fine, but I would avoid, if possible, that rust. We have some rust on the ways. Just kind of shows a little bit of neglect. You can actually see over here we got some dust. Let's get rid of this. So it's been sitting for a while. You can see the rust here. Again, could this be a great machine? Yes, but it's just going to take some cleanup. We don't know anything about lathe wear. We're just kind of going off what we can see. Tailstock's nice and heavy duty, which is what you can expect with a pacemaker. And we have some lathe dogs that might be included. We have something rigged over here. Looks like an oiling system or something. Kind of hard to tell. And we have the motor on top, which I really don't... I don't know if this is the same machine. I don't think it's the same machine, to be honest. No, it's a different machine. Yeah, you got to watch out for that. Different machine. Okay, we got a steady rest of two sizes, which is really good. We have a faceplate and a 3-jaw, so that's good. Seeing it on one of these chuck mounts or brackets, that's a good thing. Keeps it off the floor. That's a bonus there. Yeah, it was a totally different machine. Not a lot of photos on this. My initial impressions of this machine would be if you can get it cheap, under $2,000, and you're not looking for a high precision machine, that's not the right machine. It'd be probably a decent machine, but based on the condition and the poor pictures, I wouldn't pay a lot for this equipment. Ideally, this would be a great like $1,000 machine. Something like this, based on the size, you're probably looking at, just trying to get a better photo, the length looks long-ish, maybe 12, 14 feet long. That's not the right machine. But yeah, that probably is going to cost you a G just to load. So I wouldn't pay more than $1,000 for it. Let's see what else we got. Okay, this is a good example of a short lathe that I wouldn't buy. So this lathe is an Mazak. Mazak is Japanese. That's a great brand. Very beefy lathe, but it's pretty short for being beefy. Doesn't mean it can't do good work, but I would love to see a longer version of this lathe to really take advantage of the beefy nature, the high quality build, and the usability. Being short right here really cuts you guys short, no pun intended, on the work pieces you can do. Let's see if there's other pictures or if that's it. I hate when they just do one photo. Yep, just one photo, so I probably avoid that machine. Let's see. Here's another pacemaker. I always love looking at these because I have a pacemaker, just looking at the quality. This is very typical of what you see of the pacemaker lathes. Very heavy duty, but very neglected, very grungy. Let's see what we got. Huge tailstock. Look at all this gunk on the lathe bed. That's a very bad sign. I'm sure this machine runs. I'm sure it's very neglected. And obviously in this case, they're using it to turn what looks like a rubber roller down. So they're not even using it for typical lathe work. Sometimes you see these retrofitted lathes. This probably wouldn't be good for most people, but if you got it super cheap or you had free loading, it could be a good machine. It comes with a nice steady rest here. But yeah, this machine is covered in grease and grime. It's probably been sitting for a while. Oh yeah. So this would also be a good machine for parts. This machine will probably go cheap. It'll cost more to rig than it will to sell. I can't tell the spindle speeds there, but I'm sure it doesn't go with this size chuck anything more than 1,000. Let's see. Carriage is nice and beefy. Other than that, looks like they have something custom set up here for tooling, so we can assume that they're just using it for non-traditional lathe work. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me try to find some smaller machines here. Here's a hard-hinge. This is a machine that's really nice. It's a small machine. 500 bucks. Oh yeah, this is in good shape. Okay, so what I see immediately is the paint's got a shine to it, and it looks original, so that means it probably hasn't seen a lot of use. We have a new all DRO, we have a collet closer and variable speed, and the variable speed feed. This is a precision lathe. This one looks to be in good shape. This is probably going to go for a pretty penny. Looks like the wear is not too bad. Here he's given an overall length, looks like 36 inches. Looking really, really nice. Let's see, we have coolant pump. On these hard hinge machines, they're kind of, everything's built into the base, makes it really nice and easy. Sometimes they have collets stored in the base. No broken knobs. I think that's just something on the lens. We have air. These are really nice machines, just kind of showing specs. And there's that new all readout. Looks like we have up to 3,000 RPMs. And we have a brake. And then this is showing the motor. Look at that beefy motor for this small lathe. And then here's those collets that I was talking about. So this machine comes with some good tooling. Has an owner's operator manual. This is like, so far out of all the machines we've seen, even though this isn't a standard size, this is what you want to see. Now this machine I'm sure will go for at least $6,000 or plus. But yeah, if you could get one of these for under $6,000, it'd be a great second op machine for most shops. Or if you're doing small machinery, this would be a really nice small lathe. And it's already got a bid. It looks like it's in Colorado. Yeah, if you want to come back and see what this sells for, just if you're curious. Like one that I would avoid. Let me show you why. All right, so this machine can be a good machine for the right person, but it's got a lot of things that I would avoid. So first, it only has one feed rod / lead screw like we talked about. Second, it kind of looks like a plain bearing machine, meaning either it's Babbitt or brass for the spindle bearings, just based on the clearance over here by the spindle. Now, I don't know if it's a thread-on chuck. Kind of looks like it might be some sort of cam lock, but it also has a drum switch, which isn't ideal, but it's not the end of the world. Overall, the casting looks nice and heavy duty. The carriage looks pretty wide, but it looks like a very simple lathe. I wouldn't get it as a main lathe. Could be a good second operation lathe, or if you're not trying to do anything crazy precision. Other than that, this machine is pretty old. We have a lantern tool post, so that's pretty much the worst case tool post there is, so I would avoid that. I'm sure something like this will be very interested, or I'm sorry, for something like this, a lot of hobby guys would be really interested in, and you know, it could work well for those guys, but there are certainly better options even for the hobby crowd than this machine. Yeah, you can tell. All right, here, this picture tells you a lot. We got a lantern tool post. Look at how narrow this cross slide is in this region, and look at how dirty this is. This machine is very old. I'm sure it can do okay work, but I personally would avoid this machine. You can get machines. See, the thing is with a machine like this machine will probably go for $500 to $1,000, which is pretty cheap. But if you're patient, you can find machines that are 50, 60 years newer that go maybe $500 more, and they add way more value than only $500 additional in cost. There's kind of a threshold with lathes or equipment or cars where they don't really go below a certain price because once it gets to a certain price, they're worth the scrap value. So this lathe might go for $500 because you could get $300 or $400 out of it in scrap, but if you paid just a little bit more, you could get a significantly better lathe. Now, a lot of guys do like these South Bend lathes because they look cool. They have nice rounded features, but to be honest, I would avoid this machine even though it looks cool. It's got the follow rest with the friction followers, not as good as the roller bearing type. We do have some tooling, but you can see how chowdered up all of these centers are. They're pretty rough looking. That chuck isn't a super chuck, which isn't the end of the world, but it's a little bit cheaper and looking pretty rough. Overall, just not liking what I see on this machine. Let's see, this machine looks like it could be pretty nice. Now this machine is going to be longer and bigger, but this looks like an excellent machine. First off, it's a LeBlond. LeBlond makes excellent equipment. It looks like a newer LeBlond, meaning, you know, 80s, 90s, 70s possibly. So it's not super old. The length is awesome, probably a little long for most people, but having that length is nice if you can move it. It'll cost more to move as a result, but it looks like the paint is in good shape, and it's not super dirty, which means they were taking care of it. This shop looks pretty clean. I'm seeing some cases over here, some decent organization, straps hanging up. We have a nice readout. This looks nice. This looks really nice. Let's see some closer. We have a steady rest, which is great. We have here, remember I said tooling sitting on rags or wood, keeping it off the lathe. This is good. This means that they're taking care of the bed surface, protecting it. So I like that. We have a jib crane in the back to help with heavy work pieces. So they're doing real work at this shop. We have a chuck with two-piece jaws. It is a Buck chuck, which is name brand, so that's good. In this shot, I don't see any major scoring or anything on the ways. A couple chips over here, but this is in the spot where the tailstock slides, so I'm not too worried about that. These ways aren't super shiny. You can see a little bit of grime and dirt on the ways, but overall, the ways look to be in somewhat decent shape. I don't see any broken handles or knobs. Everything looks factory. We do have an Aloris tool post. Looks like it's an Aloris brand. Yeah, with the symbol there, that's an Aloris holder. That tells me they spent some money on the tooling, which is good. Let's see. Brand new, new all readout. It's not brand new. It's probably 10 years old, but it looks like it's in very good shape. And new all is a little bit more expensive, so this is a good sign. Tailstock looks good. Honestly, the paint looks original, looks to be in good shape. No scoring on the quill. And we have a super chuck, which is nice. I do see some scoring down here in a linear pattern, which I don't love. And hopefully these marks are just kind of grease and dirt. But even back in this area, it's far from the chuck. So it's a little unusual unless they were doing a lot of longer work to have a lot of scoring over here. So this kind of tells you that maybe they did do a lot of long work on this lathe, which makes sense because it is a pretty long lathe, but that's okay. Let's see. Another bigger steady rest, which is really nice to have two. This one does have the pads. The rollers are better, but having it is nice. You can always swap out to the rollers. Just giving you the serial number. This is cool. You could call LeBlond, and you could use that serial number and see when it was built. And then back to the main shot. Overall, this lathe looks really nice. It's got its own electrical cabinet, which is cool. Looks like a pretty decent machine. Not the nicest machine, but I would say it's in the upper tier in terms of quality, just based on what I'm seeing, based on the photos and the limited information that I have. I would probably buy this sight unseen. For the length, maybe $7,000, maybe 6. 5 would be a great deal. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes for 10 or 12. People pay a lot more for the length, and this looks like a decent machine. Let's see what else we got. See if I can find you guys a 10 double E. You guys really like those. Here's a Victor. We talked about Victor. Okay, this looks similar to the one that Adam Booth has a foot brake, which is nice. We have a little bit of wear down here in the paint. No big deal there. I'm seeing nothing broken. Seeing that chip guard for your hand, which is a really nice feature. Looks like an off-brand tool post. Does have coolant, which is nice. And a quick change cam lock spindle, which is cool. Let's see. Good spindle speeds, 1800. And it looks like we may have a missing knob. Not a big deal. The light on means some electronics are working. And honestly, we got a collet closer over here. So this is kind of nice. This machine does have some rust on the chuck, on that carriage stop, and on the feed rod. So it looks like maybe someone was slinging some water or something and it got on there, but not a big deal. Yeah, you can see kind of the pitting there. That could be cleaned up. Overall, the wear doesn't look too bad. Let's see. It does have a Travidile. Those are nice, but kind of outdated. You could ditch it. Missing a knob there. Looks well used, but not necessarily abused. It does have these adjustable feed dogs, which are really nice. So you can set some stops. Looks like that handle is bent for locking the carriage. Not a big deal. And there's that collet closer. This collet closer looks a little rough. I've seen better ones, but to have one is better than not. I do like, I don't know, this is some sort of mount or rack made out of 80/20 near the lathe. So that's kind of cool. They put some effort into that, so that's nice. And then gives you the facts about the motor here. So we got 5 horsepower. That's plenty for most people, and that's adequate based on the size, and it's 3-phase. And then we have a nice electrical cabinet in the back. Chip pan keeps everything nice and clean. And this is where the coolant lives. With that cover off, I'm guessing the coolant pump doesn't work. It's pretty common. Not a big deal. And we got some hardened ways back here. They advertise that. That's nice. And it looks like it's made in Taiwan, which is kind of what we talked about earlier. Overall, this machine looks like a good machine. I wouldn't pay a crazy amount for it, but it's probably a good average machine. Not excellent. We got the manual there. That's good to see. Not excellent by any means, but not bad. A good general purpose machine. I probably would pay maybe $3,000 for it. It's probably worth a little bit more. I just probably wouldn't pay a little bit more. But this is a good general middle of the road machine. All right, let's see if we can find that Monarch, if there is one. I don't know, I haven't looked, but usually there is one or two. Oh, here's a Moriseki. I really like these machines. All right, so this is what I would consider a perfect sized lathe. We have a decent length without being too long. We have a decent chuck size and Japanese made. We have a foot brake. I'm not seeing any broken knobs. And let's take a closer look. So overall, this looks nice. Tailstock looks nice and heavy duty. We have a feed rod. We have a start rod, which helps you start the lathe anywhere along the area, which is kind of cool. Looks like they were making some nice blue chips, doing some real work. And this shop that they had was well lit, which is nice. Gives us some good photos. Some nice leveling pads down there. Let's see. Hopefully get some close-ups. Okay, so we have some custom jaws. So they were running this either for a second operation or a first operation. This chuck is probably original. The lathe wear doesn't look to be too bad. I don't see any major marks or nicks, so that's good. Let's see what else we got. We have a travel dial mag base, so that's cool. This is pretty grimy and greasy. I don't love that. It should be nice and clean, but not the end of the world. This is a good lathe that probably could be cleaned up and become a really nice lathe. It has probably good bones. We have a coolant setup here and Dorian tool holder. I don't know that that's a Dorian tool post, but the holder is more expensive than an import, so that's good to see. Let's see what else. Yeah, Moriseki, Japan, made in Japan right there. That's really nice to see. And we have here is just our feed selection. And we have a nice stamp in the casting that takes extra money to do that. That shows some pride in the casting. And then the coolant tray is off. We've seen that before. Coolant pump probably doesn't work. But hey, that is what it is. We have a back splash to kind of help with the chips, but it isn't fully enclosed. It'd be nice if it was fully enclosed, but that can always be modified. And then a nice little marking on the bedway. Notice the font is of a certain font, and we have a symbol. On a lot of the Chinese or Taiwanese lathes, they use a different font, and they forego the symbol. It's just extra work, so this is good to see. From here, the way look good, but this is the back. It's not used a lot back here, so yeah, that's this machine. This looks like a great machine. This machine here, I'd probably pay $7K for it. It might bring 10 or 12 just because of the length being a little longer. This looks like a solid machine. It isn't the best machine I've seen condition-wise, but it looks like a good machine, maybe a little bit on the upper end of good. That's a great machine. All right, let's see. I don't want to go through all this. This the video will be way too long, but let me see if I can find a 10EE because everyone loves a Monarch. Let's see. All right, here we go. Here's a 10EE for you. All right, let's see. We got enough pictures. All right, so this this is a little bit common with these 10EEs. This one is in the middle of a teardown. And I know you think that I have hate for 10Es. I really do like these machines, but there's a lot of things that can cause issues. And so for most first-time lathe buyers, we steer clear of these lathes. But this one, unfortunately, is a lathe that you should pass up. It'll probably go cheap. This would be a great machine to buy for parts. The carriage is apart. There's no feed rods. It's missing parts. Some of them might be in this tray. Overall, this looks like it might be factory paint, and it looks like it might be in decent shape, but it looks like someone tried to tear it down. If you look in the background, there's nothing around this machine. So probably what happened is they sold a lot of the equipment, and this machine didn't sell, and so they sent it over to Bidspotter or whoever auctioned it off. And this is probably what remains. So it's probably going to go cheap. It's probably not very desirable, but let's take a closer look. On the back, we do have an electrical cabinet that's not original. It's newer, so that's cool. This stuff is original over here. We have a steady rest, possibly. It looks a little strange. Could be from a different machine. And you can see they have a top slide just sitting here on the ways, so that's not ideal. We have the nice flame-hardened way badge, which is cool. Let's see. Okay, here's some parts. So we have parts from the top slide. You can see we have the dial. We have the screw. Looks like we're missing some parts. And yeah, here's the carriage. Yeah, we're missing some parts. This would not be a good lathe to get unless you're getting it for parts. And we have the serial number, tells you the swing. Overall, I would avoid this machine. It looks like we might have a Royal Center in there, which is nice. Might be an MT2 or 3 from looking at it. These machines can be good, but this is an example of one that I would avoid. Let me see if we can find a better version of that machine. Because I know everyone... Here we go. Everyone wants a 10E. All right, here's another one with missing parts. Surprise, surprise. So a couple things right off the hop. First off, we're missing the back cover. Why is it off? That's a red flag. Second, we have the cover out in the front, probably because it's going to have electrical issues, and that's really common on these machines. So let's take a closer look. We also have some red tags. That's not great. Let's see. Let's get us some close-ups. Okay, so we have a missing cover. That cover is going to be impossible to find. So that'd be a reason I wouldn't buy this machine. This belt looks like it's getting ready to fall apart. Not a big deal. Looks like everything else is in here. All the badges and everything are on the front, so that's good. This is cracked. Sourcing a new one of those would suck. Does it affect the functionality? No, but these RPM gauges are pretty prone to going bad, so be aware of that. This chuck is extremely cheap and needs to be swapped out. It's pretty thin, and it's a one-piece jaw. It's pretty rusted. Yeah, not a great chuck. We do have another type of quick release tool post. This is a better option than a lantern, but it's still not a great option. This machine is probably red tagged for a reason. It looks like it has a tag and a lock on it. My guess is with all these machines sealed up in the back, this is probably one of the last machines to be sold off, and there's probably a reason why it's red tagged. So I would avoid it. Tailstock looks fine. And there's a shot of that. We don't know what this means, but I guarantee you it means that there's an issue in there. And without saying it, that's what they're showing you. This would be a good parts machine, but whatever machine's next to it would probably be better than this machine. Let's see what else we got. Here's a Monarch that's probably a good machine. This will be the last one. This is actually the one that I really like, which is the 61 series. This is a great looking machine. So first off, Monarch, great machine, great manufacturer. This machine looks complete compared to the other one. First thing we notice is we have really nice manufactured feed tags. We have a nice quick change spindle mount chuck, and we have a good length here. Let's get closer, see what other things we can find. See, I really like this. They go through the effort of putting their name in the casting. That shows a lot of pride in the manufacturing. The other thing I like about this lathe, it has really deep, accessible chip trays that makes the user experience really nice. And we have a 6-jaw chuck, which is kind of cool. And nothing too noteworthy here. We got some extra parts. Looks like a pulley of some kind. I'm sure this machine runs and operates. These machines have helical gears in the headstock. They're really stout, well-built machines. The only real con is they have a small spindle bore, and usually the RPMs can be a little on the slower side, but this could be a really nice machine. Quick change feed box. These were originally backfilled in black, these labels, so it's pretty worn. It's taken a lot of use, but this machine I think is from the 50s, so it's pretty old. 70 years. Yeah, you can see here the speeds. I can't even read it. It might be 1,000. Can't tell if this is spindle speeds or the quick change. Probably this quick change. Or wait, nope, it was the spindle speeds. So someone will correct me down below, but I think these are the spindle speeds, and I think I'm seeing 1,000 RPM. So 1,000's good. 1,000's good with me. This would be a good RPM. Yeah, here are the threads. So that was the spindle speeds. Now this chuck isn't the cleanest chuck for a 6-jaw, but hey, it is a 6-jaw, so that's kind of cool. And other than that, we have a chuck key up there laying on a piece of wood. Not ideal, but whatever. The ways don't look too bad. This machine's old. It probably has a lot of wear, but you could make some good parts on this machine. Looks like a buck 6-jaw chuck, to be honest. They're showing the lathe. We have more black than I would like to see, but I don't see any dings or dents. This is probably middle of the road in terms of condition. Nothing broken or missing, really. We don't have a tool post. That kind of sucks. Looks like we are set up for coolant, which is good. Guarantee this coolant pump doesn't work. Actually, look, the hole where the coolant pump is, I don't see it, so probably not working. Pretty common. Oh, we have a broken wave wiper. Not a big deal. Easy fix. All these knobs look fine. That one looks like it could potentially be aftermarket. It's probably more of a rounder one like this, but that's just kind of my gut. And this tailstock, looks fine. A little grimy up here, and it looks like we're using a tube for the lock. That's not ideal, but that could be addressed. And the wear looks good, but they're kind of showing you the back. You don't really use the back too much, so it's a little bit misleading. I think this is the spindle hole. This is the point I was making for the size lathe. This is probably like a 1 7/8 or 2 1/8. Kind of a small spindle hole, but it is what it is. And that's this machine. Overall, this would be a great machine. I would personally like to own and restore this machine, but for my shop and my business, it's probably not a wise buy for me. As long as you came into this machine knowing it's got wear and it's old and you wanted to clean it up, probably be an excellent machine. This machine, I think I would pay $5 grand for. It probably will go as high as, I don't know, 10 or 12, being it is a Monarch. But for 10 or 12, you could certainly get better machines. But it would be a good buy at $3 to $5 grand, I would say. Rigging on this thing probably is going to cost you $500 to $1,400 to get put on a trailer based on the weight. This machine's probably 12,000 pounds, 10,000 pounds. So just keep that in mind. But it looks like a nice machine overall. I'd probably grab that Moriseki over this. But this is a good machine. Probably be the runner up to that Moriseki. And of the machines we've seen, I'd probably go for the LeBlanc first, the Moriseki second, and maybe this third. So that wraps up kind of going through machining or looking at these machines on Bidspotter. This was very long-winded, but I wanted to just take you through my thought process for the people that are watching this. I know it'll be helpful to see how someone who knows a lot about lathes is thinking and what they're doing when they're looking at these machinery. So we're going to hop back over to our outro and kind of wrap up this video. I hope this section was nice and helpful for you guys. Well, guys, that's it. Making this video was a ton of fun and a lot of work, but I know it was worth it. Buying a lathe can be very overwhelming, but having the knowledge is your biggest asset. One of the last things to do is to get out there and go purchase that machine. If If you guys have any questions or comments, corrections, let's get the dialogue going in the comments section down below, and we'll see you in the next one.